Chapter 16 of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 16. A Cloud That's Dragonish. At the first opportunity, Mirliflor had returned to the Pavilion Groves, where he need no longer worship from a distance. Daphne had received him graciously enough, but somehow he went away with a feeling that he had lost ground. He saw her every day after that, occasionally in the daytime, whenever he could evade the head gardener's eye, and always in the evening. She would talk to him from a window, or sometimes she would consent to come out and stroll with him in the golden dusk along grass-grown paths bordered with high and ragged walls of yew. And yet he parted from her with a sorer heart every evening. She had been as enchanting as ever, but quite as indifferent. It was useless to tell her how he loved her. Whenever he had tried, she had made him understand that, if he said any more, he would spoil the friendship between them. So he said no more. Sometimes she had made him angry. Unfortunately, he could never quite forget his rank, and he resented the airy way in which she treated him as a person of no particular importance. She would even laugh at his efforts to assert his dignity. And he was unused to being laughed at, especially as he often did not even understand why she laughed. For fairy princes have never been noted for their sense of humour, and poor Mirliflor was certainly no exception. Once, when she had innocently permitted herself to remark that she thought Prince Mirliflor had shown very little spirit or determination in his wooing of Princess Edna, he lost his temper so completely as to tell her that she would be wiser not to pass judgment on matters of which she knew so little. Daphne's silence showed how deeply he had offended, but he was too proud to conciliate her, and so his evening came to an abrupt end in mutual coolness. On his way back he cursed himself for his folly. He had done for himself now. She would never forgive him, never speak to him again. How could he have been so mad when his only happiness was being near her? But when he ventured back the next evening, prepared for final dismissal, he found her as frank and friendly as ever. She seemed to have forgotten that they had ever fallen out at all. Unfortunately, this was rather humiliating than gratifying, since it only showed how utterly insignificant he was in her eyes. But Daphne did not actually consider him insignificant at all. She was rather interested in this plain, ordinary-looking youth with a lofty manner and an air of authority that seemed so incongruous, and yet, even while she laughed at him for them, impressed her in spite of herself. He was not quick at seeing a joke, especially against himself, and she enjoyed teasing and provoking him as she would not have done in the case of anyone she disliked. She knew he was absolutely devoted to her, and although she had made him understand that he must avoid any approach to sentiment, she was touched by his devotion, and sorry that she could make him no better return. But it's no use, she thought remorsefully. I simply couldn't care in that way for any man who hadn't some good looks. I can't be more than a friend to Giroflé, and luckily I believe he's beginning to see that at last. Mirliflor had certainly begun to see that he was too severely handicapped to have a chance of success, and he paid a secret visit to his godmother's apartments to tell her so. But she was deaf to all his protests, and declined to restore him to his own form until he had either won Daphne or been refused by her. He came away furious, regretting that he had ever been such a fool as to put himself at the mercy of this obstinate old fairy's whims. If he had not, he would not have met Daphne. But better 1,000 times that he had never seen her if she was not to be his. His visit had one result. Old Baron von Eisenbänden happened to observe him leaving the tower, and it struck him as suspicious that so august a personage as the court godmother should have any dealings with an under-gardener. She must be using the fellow as her agent in some intrigue or other, he concluded, and as she had not chosen to confide in him, it was clearly his duty to his sovereigns to discover what she was about. His cap of darkness might be of service to him here, but since the fiasco of the self-supplying tables, he had been distrustful of any article supplied by the Astrologer Royal. However, it seemed as though the sudden decay of the tables had been due less to any malicious revenge on Curiel's part than to some imperfection in his magic, for the cap proved to be as efficient as ever. So, after satisfying himself of this, the worthy Baron put it on and prowled unseen about the Court Godmother's tower. For some days his vigilance was unrewarded, but at length he saw Giroflée hurrying down a gallery that led to the Fairy's door, and immediately gave chase. Unfortunately, he arrived too late to slip in behind him, and the thickness of the door made it impossible to overhear anything of the conversation till the very end of the interview. Then, as the door was open and the Court Godmother had accompanied Giroflée to the threshold, their parting words were perfectly audible. "You are setting me an impossible task, Godmother Voldoiseau," he heard the mysterious young under gardener declare. "I am no nearer her than when I came, and I never shall be till you restore me to my proper self." "I shall do that when I see fit, Mirliflor," the Fairy replied, "and not a moment before. You have only to be patient a little longer, and all will be well. I know her better than you can, remember, and believe me, you have no cause to despair." "So you have told me before," he said bitterly, "but I can't and won't endure this much longer, and if you refuse to make it easier for me, I shall give up and go back to Clair-de-Lune." "My dear Mirliflor," she retorted, "you won't be such a fool." He left her at that without another word, but the Court Chamberlain had heard enough to surprise him considerably. So this young gardener, it seemed, was really Prince Mirliflor transformed. The Baron knew that such a transformation was within the Fairy's powers, so, in spite of the total dissimilarity between the Prince and the gardener, he never for a moment doubted that they were one and the same. But why the Court Godmother should have chosen to act in this arbitrary manner, and how she supposed it could promote Prince Mirliflor's object, was incomprehensible. It was only natural that he should rebel against her, and the Court Chamberlain felt so much sympathy for the ill-used young Prince that he resolved to follow him to the gardens and offer his advice and assistance. Mirliflor had already begun to rake a flower bed with vindictive energy, when he heard himself addressed from behind, and turned to recognize the elderly official he had good cause to remember. "Hard at work, I see," began the Baron, with a casual air intended for any witnesses of the interview. "Work," he added, cautiously lowering his voice, "which, if I may be allowed to say so, sire, can hardly be other than distasteful to His Royal Highness Prince Mirliflor of Clair-de-Lune." Mirliflor noticed the purple cap which was still in the other's hand, and knew it would be useless to deny his identity. "So, Baron," he said, "you have been eavesdropping again, have you? Well, if you were in the Court Godmother's chambers just now, as I suppose you were, you know how I come to be in this position." "I am aware, sire," he said, "that your Royal Highness has been induced to accept it in the hope of obtaining the hand of a certain person whom it would perhaps be inadvisable to name." "Certainly we will not name her," said Mirliflor, "nor need we discuss a matter that so entirely concerns myself." "I should not permit myself the indiscretion, sire, if I did not so ardently desire that your Royal Highness's suit may prosper. But so long as you remain in the form you have deigned to assume, I cannot think you will approach your Princess with the least chance of success." "I agree, Baron, but as the Court Godmother happens to think otherwise, I'm powerless, you see." "She is a most gracious and venerable lady," said the Baron, "but though her will is as strong as ever, her mind is evidently weakening. If your Royal Highness would be guided by me, I will venture to say that you would find it more to your advantage." "Well, Baron, and what is your suggestion?" "I have but to inform Her Majesty of the facts," he said, "and she will at once order the Court Godmother Vogelflug to restore your Royal Highness to your own form, in which, believe me, sire, you need have no fear of refusal." "Listen to me, Baron," said Mirliflor, who knew very well how his old godmother would treat such an order. "You will say nothing whatever to Her Majesty of my being here, and I'll tell you why you will not. If you do, she will necessarily have to hear of your method of acquiring the information, and it's not a very creditable method, Baron." "I have done nothing I am ashamed of," he said doggedly. Her Majesty will recognize that I have acted solely from devotion to her interests." "Possibly. But I fancy she will also recognize that a Court Chamberlain who uses the cap of darkness to overhear private conversations is an official whose devotion might be occasionally inconvenient. I really don't think I should mention it, Baron, if I were you." Even he appeared to see the force of this. "Since your Royal Highness desires your presence here to remain unknown, I will observe the greatest discretion," he said stiffly. "I have the honour to leave your Royal Highness to pursue his occupation." And with this he withdrew, with very obvious affront. He left Mirliflor even more disturbed than before. The Baron, having been present unseen at his interview with his godmother, evidently knew all about his hopes with regard to Daphne, and seemed, for some reason that Mirliflor could not fathom, anxious for his success. But though the Court Chamberlain had promised discretion, Mirliflor doubted whether he would be able to keep such a secret long. He was quite capable of thinking that, in Mirliflor's own interests, he was justified in disclosing it. And then Mirliflor pictured himself summoned in his present form before the whole Court, where he had last appeared as Princess Edna's suitor, the difficulty of explaining his recent behaviour, the general indignity and humiliation he would be exposed to, even if the Fairy did not repudiate all knowledge of him, which he was quite capable of doing. No, he could not stay to face all that. He must leave the Palace that very night, and without a word to his godmother. Why should he see her when nothing he could urge would have the slightest effect? Perhaps, when she heard he was back at Clairdelune, it would bring her to her senses. Nor would he go through any parting scene with Daphne. What was it to her whether he went or stayed? If he saw her, he might be tempted to tell her how passionately and hopelessly he loved her, and she would only laugh at him. In self-respect, he would spare himself that. He adhered to this resolution till long past our usual hour for meeting, and he had made all his preparations for departure, when he was suddenly seized with an uncontrollable longing to see her once more, whatever pain it might cost him afterwards. So, with some scorn of his own weakness, he let himself through the postern gate and went in search of her. At the end of one of the yew walks was a rusty astrolabe on a moss-grown marble pedestal, and by this he found her. Her back was towards him as she faced the western horizon, where clouds of rose and gold were sailing in a sky of warm apple green, which toned above them to a luminous silvery blue. On the edge of the slope in the foreground some cypresses were silhouetted in purplish bronze. She turned as she heard his footsteps, her face so wondrously fair in the half-light that his heart ached afresh at the sight of her. "I had quite given up expecting you, Giroflé," she said, with a nonchalance that concealed her pique at his unusual tardiness, for it must be owned that she had become a trifle exacting of late. "It's so late now that I shall have to go in very soon." "I shall not keep you long, Daphne," he replied, determined to show himself no less indifferent than was she. "I had to prepare for my journey, as I am leaving Eswareinmal tonight, and I have only come to say good-bye." She was not only startled, but deeply hurt. If he had really been so devoted as he had seemed, she thought, he could never have spoken of leaving her in this casual tone. But she would not let him see how he had wounded her. "Tonight?" she repeated. "I'd no idea you meant to go so soon as this. But I dare say you were only too glad to get away." "Is one ever sorry," he said, in spite of himself, "to get away from a place where one has suffered?" She had turned to the astrolabe again, and was idly tracing out the incisions in one of its hoops with her supple forefinger when she next spoke. "Of course I know it must have been hard for you, Giroflé," she said. "Still, I hoped... It was very foolish and conceited of me, I know, but I hoped that perhaps my being here made it more bearable." "If you had not been here, I should never have come at all," he said. "You did not know that, Daphne, but I may tell you now. And at first it is true that just to see and be near you now and then was happiness enough. But of late the hours I've spent here have brought me little but the misery of longing for what must ever be denied. She could no longer misunderstand. So far from his devotion having abated, it was stronger than she had ever imagined, and the discovery made her sorrier for him than ever. "Giroflé," she cried remorsefully, "I never knew you felt it like that. I thought you understood, and were content with all that I could give you. Oh, why can't you be?" "And what have you given me, Daphne? What am I to you? Nothing. Nothing. You are my friend, the dearest friend I've ever had. Is that nothing, Giroflé?" "Nothing compared with what I once hoped to be. Hoped, while even then I knew how impossible any hope was. And yet, what adds to my torment is that I know, yes, Daphne, I know, that if by an evil fate I had not been what I am, I could have made you love me. I am very sure of that." She was looking at him as he spoke, and somehow she ceased to think him plain. And suddenly she knew that he had become necessary to her, so necessary that the thought of losing him was unendurable. "And why," she said, "are you so sure that it is impossible now, Giroflé?" "Daphne," he cried incredulously, "do you mean that you can love me, even as I am?" She did not reply in words, but her face, as she raised it to his, was answer enough. And then he held her in his arms, into which she nestled with a little sigh of perfect content. He could not understand how so marvellous and unlooked for a thing could have happened to him, and Daphne herself might have been at some loss to account for her sudden surrender. But she did not try. She only knew that she had been quite powerless to help it, and did not regret it. "And you will not go away from Eswareinmal now, Giroflé?" she said a little later, when they were sitting on a stone seat under an ilex, and the gold and silver stars were beginning to come out in the deep violet sky. "Not alone, dearest," he replied. "But it will not be wise to stay here long. I was recognized this afternoon by that meddling old imbecile of a court chamberlain." "Giroflé!" she exclaimed, clinging to him in terror. "Will he give you up? Can he do anything to you? If there's danger, let us escape at once, for of course I shan't let you go alone." "There's no danger," he said. "If he lets out that I am here, it would be inconvenient, but no worse. And I think the Court Godmother will see me through it now. I will tell her our news tomorrow morning." "I'm afraid," said Daphne, "she won't at all approve of my marrying you. She may even try to prevent it. But she won't succeed." "She is more likely to be on our side," he said. He refrained even then from telling her why. He might be already released from his promise of silence, but he no longer rebelled against it, nor had he any impatience now to regain his own form. And so they talked on far into the night, discussing their future life together, which Daphne cheerfully assumed would be humble enough for a time, and he said nothing to disabuse her. Why should he not enjoy as long as he could the sensation, denied to most princes and millionaires, of being beloved for himself alone? At an early hour the next morning, after carefully ascertaining that the Baron had not yet risen, he waited on the Fairy, who heard what he had to tell with high good humour and complacency. "Most satisfactory, my dear Mirliflor," she said, "and everything has turned out exactly as I always told you it would. I shall visit her this morning and prepare her for the future in store for her. As for you, you must get to your work as usual, and at noon you will find us at the end of the yew walk behind the pavilion. I shall have to change you back to yourself again, and I'm thankful to say it will be the last time I shall ever be called upon to do anything of that sort. Then I shall take you both in the stork car to Clairdelune, and we shall hear what your royal father thinks of the bride you have chosen. He may consider that an ex-lady-in-waiting is not—" "He has only to see her," declared Mirliflor. "But, object as he may, no thing and no one shall separate us now." "Well, well, if it comes to that, I dare say I shall manage to overcome his objections," she said. she might have been more explicit if she had not decided to reserve the surprise of Daphne's royal descent until the final scene at Clair de Lune, which would be far more effective, as well as safer. "And don't worry yourself about that foolish old Baron," she concluded. "We shall be gone before he can give any trouble. Now be off with you. I shan't want you till noon, and a few more hours gardening won't hurt you." There was no need to hurry, so she did not leave her tower till it was nearly half an hour to midday, when she went slowly and by unfrequented paths through the gardens and thence to the pavilion. Daphne, who had been anxiously expecting her, saw her from the pavilion and came to meet her, feeling and looking rather guilty. "Have you heard?" she asked. "But I can see you have. Well, Court Godmother?" "Well," said the Fairy, bent on prolonging the test to the last moment, "this is a pretty thing you've done, upon my word. You to fall in love with a penniless student! If you'd only had the patience to wait," she continued, as she led her towards the yew walk, "I'd have found a handsome young prince for you. It's not too late even now." "I used to think I would only marry a prince. I don't now," said Daphne. "I wouldn't change Giroflé for any prince in the world. And what am I, after all? Just a governess." "And when you've married your student, what do you suppose you're going to live on?" "Oh, we shall manage somehow," said Daphne tranquilly. "We shall be poor, of course, but what does that matter, so long as we're together?" "Ah," said the Fairy, "but I can't understand what a beautiful girl like you can see in such an ugly young fellow." "He isn't ugly," Daphne declared, "and I shouldn't mind a bit if he was. He'd still be Giroflé." "All the same," pursued the Fairy, "you wouldn't object to his being handsomer?" "I don't know," replied Daphne, contracting her pretty brows. "I can't imagine him any different." And then she laughed. "It's not a bit of use trying to put me out of conceit with him, Court Godmother, so you may as well give it up." The Fairy was satisfied at last. Daphne had stood the test triumphantly, and the time had come for her to be told of the reward that awaited her. "I am far from wishing to lower him in your eyes, my child," she said. "On the contrary, I may now tell you that he possesses advantages you little dream of. And though true love may be inspired without the aid of wealth, rank, or good looks, there was never a maiden yet who But I perceive," she broke off with offended dignity, "that I am not so fortunate as to have secured your attention." They had left the yew walk by this time and entered an avenue of ilexes, beyond which lay the valley and distant hills. "I'm so sorry, Court Godmother," said Daphne, whose eyes were fixed on the view, but doesn't Dragonstolz lie over there?" "It does," said the Fairy dryly, "though I fail to see why that should interest you just now." I can see something flying," explained Daphne. "It may be only a vulture, a large vulture." "A vulture? Where?" cried the old Fairy. "Nonsense! It's your fancy, child. I see nothing." "It is a dragon!" faltered Daphne. "Can't you see it now? It's coming towards us. And oh, I'm afraid the Count has sent it, like that snake, to kill me." A dragon was a danger which the Fairy, with all her precautions, had somehow omitted to foresee, and for a time she exhibited about as much calmness and self-possession as a hen at a fox raid. "Heaven preserve us!" she wailed. "If we were but safe at Clair de Lune, what can we do?" "Hide," said Daphne, trembling. "Quick, in the undergrowth." "It would spy us out from above," groaned the Fairy. "No, we must run for the pavilion and shelter there." Daphne seized her hand and they ran together, but they had not gone far before the Court Godmother suddenly collapsed. "My old legs fail me," she said. "I can go no further. Run on, child, while you can." "And leave you?" cried Daphne. "No, I shan't do that. But oh, can't you do anything to save us? Think!" The Fairy rose to her feet, shaking all over. "I knew a spell once," she mumbled. "I never tried it, but if I could only remember it now, it might. But I can't. I'm too old, too old. That all my plans should have come to this." The dragon was forging along at a tremendous pace. It would soon be near enough to single out its prey, and still the old Fairy stood there, racking her memory in vain. Close upon noon, Mirliflor had thrown away his hoe and torn off his apron for ever. In a few minutes more he would be with his love, and yet his heart was oppressed by a certain fear that had been haunting him all the morning. The Fairy would retransform him, but could he be sure of the effect on Daphne? What if he lost, as Mirliflor, the love that Giroflée had won? He was so absorbed in these disquieting reflections as he alternately hastened and checked his pace down the broad walks that he scarcely noticed a faint outcry, and sounds as though firearms were being discharged, which seemed to come from the palace behind him. Perhaps, he thought, a revolt had broken out, but if so, it did not concern him. His Daphne was in no danger in those grounds beyond the wall. He passed through the gate, and presently came to the astrolabe, and then the stone bench, both hallowed now by the sweetest associations, and yet it might be that those associations would be his last with her. It was almost a relief, on reaching the yew walk, to find it deserted. He went to the pavilion, and there he elicited from Daphne's elderly duenna, who was rather hard of hearing, that, as her young mistress was certainly not indoors, he would probably find her in the grounds. He searched all the yew walks in vain, and then, with a new and growing uneasiness, he turned towards the avenue, but he had got no farther than a small pool in a marble basin when he heard a strange and dreadful noise above him. He glanced upwards and saw the bulk of a huge dragon sailing high above the treetops. It was making swiftly for the valley. One of its claws held a pendant form in fluttering drapery, and he knew too well that the captive could only be she for whom he had been searching. He had saved her once from the malice of her enemies. This time he was powerless. He raved and cursed in impotent rage and despair, while a sudden gust swept the pool and sent it surging over the brim, and a slender cypress that stood hard by rustled and shivered as though in terror. And as he stood there, he suddenly saw the old court chamberlain before him, holding in one hand his silken cap and in the other a sword and belt. "Sire, sire," he stammered, "that accursed beast! It is bearing her off to Drachenstolz. But you may save her yet." "Show me how to get there," said Mirliflor fiercely. "If I can't save her, I can at least die with her. But those two devils shall pay for it first." "Follow me," said the Baron, giving him the sword, and, followed by Mirliflor, he ran at a very creditable speed for his years in the direction of the palace. A little before noon that morning the royal family had collected on one of the terraces. King Sidney was pacing up and down, engaged in private and apparently important conversation with the Crown Prince. The court, as usual, kept a respectful distance and chatted and gossiped in whispers. The Princess Royal and Princess Ruby were sitting at a jade table playing the game that resembled Halma, while the Queen was confiding her maternal anxieties to the Court Chamberlain's sympathetic ear. "To tell you the truth, Baron," she confessed, "I've not been at all happy lately about Princess Edna. She says nothing, but I can see she's fretting over Prince Mirliflor's silence. I hear he hasn't been seen at Clairdelune lately. Taken his dismissal so much to heart that he can't appear in public, I suppose. But surely, if he meant to try again, he would have done so before this." The worthy Baron was too faithful a servant to refrain from saying something to reassure his royal mistress, though a salutary recollection of Mirliflor's warning made him careful not to say too much. "I can assure your Majesty, from my own personal knowledge," he replied, "that His Royal Highness has by no means given up his intention of renewing his addresses to the Princess Edna." "Then why doesn't he? There's nothing to prevent him now." "That, madam," said the Baron importantly, "I am not at liberty to explain." As a matter of fact, he had no idea why Mirliflor was conducting his courtship in so eccentric a manner. But I may say I have reason to know that at this very moment he may be nearer the palace than is generally supposed. "Really?" cried the Queen. "I must go and tell dear Edna that. It will cheer her up." "I must beg of your Majesty to treat it as strictly confidential for the present," said the Baron hastily. "His Royal Highness prefers to take the Princess by surprise." "What a dear romantic person he is!" said Queen Selina. "Then, of course, he must be humoured, and I'll say nothing. But I'm so glad you told me, Baron. It's taken such a load off my mind." "Well," the King was telling Clarence, "those are old Goldenbergenland's terms. If you'll marry his daughter, Princess Popanza, he'll let us have all the gold we want. If you refuse, he won't even advance us a ducat. Couldn't you see your way to meeting him, my boy?" "Nothing doing," said Clarence very decidedly. "Why, Hans Meinigel was telling me the other day she's humpbacked, with a squint or something. I couldn't take it on. Even if," he added gloomily, "there weren't other reasons to prevent me." "Then," said his father, "I don't know how we're to get a fresh supply of gold. The mines stopped working, and the confounded Council won't do anything for us." "What's the matter with selling a few jewels?" suggested Clarence, as his eye fell on the Halma board in passing. "They must be worth a lot." "Not here. Too common. The people think they're of no value except to kings and queens. Nothing but gold will go down in these parts. So you see, my boy, that unless you can bring yourself to—" "I say, Governor," interrupted Clarence, who seemed to welcome a distraction just then. "Look over there! That beggar Rubenfresser has let loose that poisonous dragon of his. Infernal cheek!" "He was expressly told to keep it under control," said the King. "Most irregular." "It's not only loose," said Clarence, "but it's coming straight over here." Ruby had seen it too, and sprang up, delighted. "Look!" she cried. "There's darling Tootsie! He's got away from his horrid master, and now he's coming to live with us. I must get some cake for him!" And she darted into the Palace. "I'll go and tell those sentry Johnnies to take a pot at it," said Clarence, as he went down to a lower terrace where the Palace sentinels were on duty. By the time he returned with them, Tootsie was almost overhead, his great wings beating with a resonant leathery clang as he flew round in ever-descending circles, stretching his scaled neck and horny head in deliberate quest, until he was so low that the sunlit chalcedony slabs shed a reflected glare on his great burnished belly. "Now blaze away at it, can't you?" shouted Clarence to the sentinels, who appeared to have some difficulty in loading their antiquated pieces. "You mustn't shoot Tootsie!" cried Ruby, running out at that moment with a heavily gilded slice of gingerhead. "He's only come for some cake." "Don't encourage the thing," said the King, dragging her back. "Get away, you brute! Go home, sir!" As he spoke, the monster made a sudden downward swoop at Edna, and, with a deftness that was quite extraordinary, hooked one of its steely claws in her girdle and soared rapidly aloft with her. It was fortunate that the belt, which was of stout jewel-studded leather, was able to sustain her weight. "Stop firing, you fools!" yelled Clarence as the sentinels opened a wild fusillade. "You only hit her!" And even if their bullets could have pierced the dragon's plated hide, it was soon out of range. "It's carrying her off to that wretch!" screamed the distracted Queen. "Is there nothing we can do?" "One thing, your Majesty," said the Baron eagerly. "Offer the Princess in marriage to anyone who will rescue her. It's the usual course." To anyone?" repeated Queen Selina in despair. "Oh, Baron, must we?" "You can safely do so, madam," he whispered. "Mirliflor will be the man, and I know where to find him." And with this he rushed off first to his own chamber, then to the Crown Prince's apartments, and finally to the gardens in search of Giroflé. "Sidney," said the Queen, "tell the heralds to proclaim that we will give our poor darling to anyone who succeeds in delivering her. Don't argue about it, do as I tell you," which King Sidney did. As for the Court, they were too paralysed by so unexpected a calamity to be of the least assistance. The ladies in waiting were all in floods of tears, distressed not only by the awful fate that had overtaken Princess Four Eyes, but by the painful reflection that any one of them might be the dragon's next victim. "This couldn't have happened except in a place like this," declared the Queen, now on the verge of hysteria. "And why it should have been permitted to happen to us! It wouldn't have, Sidney, if you'd only had the sense to insist on that thing being destroyed, but you didn't, and this is the result." "My love," said the King, "you forget. The poor girl herself insisted on its being spared. It's most unfortunate." And it certainly was. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 17. The Reward of Valour. If the fairy Vogelflug could only have known that it was Edna and not Daphne who was really in danger from the dragon, she would have been comparatively calm. But since she did not know this, she was, as has been already stated, entirely unnerved for a time. Fortunately, or at least she thought it fortunate then, just before the creature was near enough to detect them, the long-forgotten words that formed the spell recurred to her memory. It was a spell that was admirably adapted to enable any fugitive to escape discovery, but she had never had occasion to use it before, and to perform it required an amount of mental concentration from which, in ordinary circumstances, she would have shrunk. Now she must act at once, or they would both perish, and so she gabbled the necessary incantations till, though the effort took a great deal out of her, she eventually succeeded in changing Daphne into a tall and slender cypress, and herself into a circular pool in a marble basin. A double transformation which was calculated to deceive the most observant and intelligent dragon. But, changed as she was, Daphne remained perfectly conscious of her own identity, and aware of all that was happening. At first she was much impressed by the court godmother's ingenuity and presence of mind, but as time went on and the dragon, instead of searching for them, seemed to have swerved away towards the palace, she began to wonder whether there had been any real need for such excessive precautions. And then Giroflée appeared, and she gathered from his despair what must have happened to the ill-fated Edna, and that he was under the erroneous impression that she herself was the victim. Surely now the moment had come for the fairy to reverse the spell. But, except that the surface of the pool was becoming violently disturbed, she made no sign. Daphne tried by rustling all her branches to attract his attention and assure him of her safety, but naturally failed. Even when the court chamberlain arrived and Giroflée had rushed away with him, she was forced to stay behind as an apparent cypress, while the fairy still retained the semblance of a more and more agitated pool. Daphne's uneasiness and anxiety would have been even greater, but for the fact that the reason for this agitation was mercifully hidden from her. The truth was that one of those accidents had happened which are not infrequent with persons who only occasionally practice the magic art. The fairy had impulsively pronounced the spell that accomplished the transformation without waiting to recall the precise formula that was needed to regain her normal appearance, and for several agonizing minutes the vitally important words persisted in evading her. To Daphne it seemed an age before the marble rim began to contract and the pool dry up, and presently, to her unspeakable relief, all trace of pool and basin disappeared, and in their place stood the fairy godmother in a sadly shaken and exhausted condition. She had strength enough, however, to restore Daphne, which she did with many groans. "I've been trying to do this for the last quarter of an hour, child," she panted. "I was beginning to think I'd forgotten the spell altogether, and now he's gone off on a fool's errand to rescue you. But I may still be in time to stop him." "You won't stop Giroflée," declared Daphne. "He will try to rescue Edna just as he would me, and if it can be done, he'll do it. I can't bear his going, godmother, and yet I hope I shouldn't prevent him even if I could." "He can't do anything," said the fairy. "He couldn't even get into the castle, and he won't be so mad as to attempt it. Go you to the pavilion and stay there till I can find out what that old fool of a baron is about with him." Daphne obeyed. She would not deter Giroflée, but to encourage him in his desperate errand was more than she was equal to just then. The court godmother hitched up her quilted skirts and went off at a hobbling run in the direction of the palace gardens. The Baron had led Mirliflor through the gardens, and then round to a courtyard at the back of the palace, in which stood a massive round tower pierced with many pigeonholes. Here he brought out a small shell-shaped car on 2 wheels, and at his whistle a flock of white doves fluttered down from the tower, and permitted him to attach them by collars and traces to the car. "The most gracious, the court godmother is nowhere to be found," he explained as he did so. But assuredly she would not grudge lending her car for such a purpose as yours, since by no other means could you hope to get over the walls of Drachenstolz. Once within them you will find the sword of inestimable service, and I doubt not that you will wield it to better effect than would its owner. I would willingly lend you this," he added, fingering the cap, "only maybe your Royal Highness would not deign to employ means which I understood you are pleased to consider discreditable." "Don't be an ass, Baron," said Mirliflor, seizing the cap and stepping into the car. "Where her life is at stake, I have no scruples in using anything whatever. But I have no experience in driving doves. How do I guide them?" "They need no guidance, sire. You have but to utter the words 'to Drachenstolz,' and they will carry you straight to the castle and set you down within its walls. God speed you!" cried the Court Chamberlain, as the Prince gave the direction and the birds ascended with the car. "Heaven grant you bring back your Princess unharmed." "Heaven grant I reach her in time," came the answer from the dove chariot, which, after making a few preliminary circles, flew away, to all appearances unoccupied. It had scarcely disappeared when the Court Godmother arrived on the scene. "Where is Giroflé?" she demanded breathlessly. "His Royal Highness Prince Mirliflor of Clairdelune," replied the Baron, "has just departed for Drachenstolz in the dove car, which I knew you would wish to be at his disposal." "And pray," said the old Fairy, "what made you think I should wish him to throw away his life for Princess Edna?" "He will not fail to rescue her, never fear, madam. No prince ever does fail in these enterprises, and if he succeeds, he need no longer hesitate to disclose himself, for you will be gratified to hear that His Majesty has promised the Princess's hand to the person who may accomplish her rescue. At," added the Baron proudly, "my own suggestion." "Oh, indeed!" retorted the Fairy. "Then it is high time you knew what kind of a royal family you have given to Maerchenland." And in a few sharp sentences she let him know the truth about the pendant which he had so rashly accepted as all sufficient proof of Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson's title to the throne. The poor Baron was aghast at the information, and still more when he heard who was really entitled to the crown. "The Lady Daphne!" he cried. "But she has been sent away to that far country, and who knows where she may be now?" "She is here still, and under my protection," said the Court Godmother. "In her own interests I had determined to keep silent as to her claims, and planned that Mirliflor should win her under the form I made him assume. All had fallen out as I expected. I had just arranged to carry them both off to Clairdelune and leave these usurpers in possession for as long as the country would endure them, when you blunder in, like the meddlesome idiot you are, Baron, and upset everything." "I have been blind indeed," he confessed. "A traitor when I thought myself most loyal. Tell me, most gracious Court Godmother, how I may best repair my error." "You can't repair it without making more mischief," she said. "The only thing you can do now is to hold your tongue about it, as I shall do myself, unless I am obliged to speak out. And now we'd better go and see what this precious King and Queen of yours are doing. And remember, Baron, your own safety will depend on your preserving absolute secrecy as to all the matters I found it necessary to acquaint you with." On the terrace, meanwhile, Queen Selina had implored the Marshal to do something, anything, towards the rescue of her elder daughter. He was not sanguine. "We could raise a force, your Majesty," he said, "to ride to Drachenstolz and assault the castle walls, but it would be quite impossible to take it by storm, even if that dragon were not among its defenders." "We'll have a try anyway," said Clarence gallantly. "Come on, you chaps, get into your fighting kit," he cried to the courtiers. "And two of you boys," he added to the pages, "just run and fetch me a helmet and breastplate and things, and bring me down a sword you'll find in my room somewhere. I shouldn't mind tackling even a dragon with that sword," he added to his mother, as the courtiers and pages ran into the palace. "It goes clean through anything." But the pages, when they returned with the breastplate and helmet and riding boots, reported that the sword was nowhere to be found. so Clarence had to content himself with a more ordinary weapon. At the last moment the Queen tried to detain him. "No, Clarence!" she cried. "You mustn't go! Your life is too valuable to be risked. There are enough going without you. Stay here, if only to protect us." "Hang it all, Mater," he said. "You can't expect me to stay here and have them saying I shirked." And he went off to the stables with the Marshal and other members of the court. "It'll be no good," groaned King Sidney. "It's as likely as not that beast has eaten the poor girl by this time." "I can't believe anything quite so horrible as that has happened, Sidney," cried the Queen. "It has only delivered her into that wretch's power, which is quite horrible enough. But there's hope still. The Baron says Prince Mirliflor is quite near here, and he's sending him to rescue her. And a real prince like dear Mirliflor ought to be a match for that miserable Reubenfresser and his dragon too." "If he could get at them he might be," said the King lugubriously. "But that's just what he can't do." On finding herself borne swiftly through the air by a dragon, Edna had done what was the correct thing to do in the circumstances. She had promptly fainted. She opened her eyes to find that she had been deposited uninjured on a truss of straw in a courtyard. On her right was the massive front of Castle Drachenstolz. Before her were its lofty walls and the grim towers that flanked its heavy gate. To the left were the stables, from the windows of which some of the black carriage horses looked out, their wrinkled lips exposing their long yellow teeth in ghastly grins. Some distance away the owner of the castle was caressing the dragon, which lay with its huge wings compactly folded, giving its unconscious imitation of a tremendously powerful dynamo. On perceiving that she had returned to consciousness, the Count came towards her, followed by the ex-Astrologer Royal, who was smirking and rubbing his hands. "I couldn't do without you," began the Count by way of explanation. "So as I couldn't come myself, I sent Tootsie for you." Edna resolved to bear herself with all the dignity of a Queen's daughter. She sat up and felt for her pince nez, and discovering that it was intact, she adjusted it on her nose. "Considering," she said, "that all is at an end between us, you had no right whatever to send your dragon to bring me here. It was a thing that no gentleman would have done." "Wouldn't that great and learned gentleman you told me of, the one whose name I always forget, have done it?" he inquired. "Nietzsche," said Edna, instructively superior even in such a crisis. "Most certainly not, even if he had owned a dragon." "You told me he did," he insisted. "A great meta something dragon that talked and said 'thou shalt not.' But if he wouldn't send his dragon for anybody, he would approve of my sending mine for you, because I was doing as he advised and acting exactly as I thought fit." She realized the hopelessness of reasoning with him. "You thought fit to act most improperly," she said severely, "and you will gain nothing by it, you know." "Oh, yes, I shall," he said, "or I shouldn't have done it." "You're quite mistaken," she assured him, "if you're imagining I shall ever consent to renew our engagement now I know what you are." "I'm what you wanted me to be," he said, "a Superman." "You're not. You're an ogre. I couldn't possibly bring myself to become an ogress." "You wouldn't make much of an ogress," he said dispassionately. "You haven't the build for it. But I'm not an ogre even yet. It's not my fault. I meant to begin with those pages of yours, but you all seem to have some ridiculous objections. Then I've sent Tootsie out to forage and pick up a small child or two, but the peasants around here are so selfish and unneighbourly that they never give him the chance, actually shutting all the children up indoors." "What else can you expect?" she demanded indignantly. "Surely your better self must see that even to attempt to devour poor helpless children is too perfectly disgusting for words." "It's disgusting when one doesn't succeed," he admitted. "I see nothing in it to object to myself. Of course, the average man may, but you've taught me what to think of his opinions." "You entirely misunderstand me," said Edna. "But I've no wish to discuss such subjects with you now. I insist on your allowing me to go home at once." "Before I do that," he said, "you must write a letter on my behalf to your parents." "I don't mind asking them to overlook the way you've treated me, and assuring them that you regret it and will behave yourself properly for the future," conceded Edna. "If you mean that." "I don't mean that," he said. "I don't want to behave properly. what they would call properly. I want to lead a fuller life than I can while I'm cooped up in my own castle. You see, it's no good having the will to power if you're not allowed any opportunities of exercising it. And I'm not, with guards stationed all around my walk to see that I don't get out. I might set Tootsie at them, it's true, but he's the only dragon I've got, and it would be very annoying if they hurt the poor thing. So you must get the king to send me free permission to go wherever I choose and do whatever I like. Then I can make a start as an ogre. At present I'm hampered at every turn." "Father and Mother," said Edna, "wouldn't hear of setting you free for such wickedness as that. It would be contrary to all their principles." "What I think you called slave morality, eh?" he said. "But you needn't tell them why I want to get out. Besides, I've other reasons. My carriage horses want airing, and I should like to drop in to lunch at the palace now and then, as I used to. Not as your betrothed, you know, that's all over, but just as a friend of the family. I always enjoyed my meals at the palace." "Oh!" gasped Edna. "I'm sure, quite sure, they would never consent to receive you again. How could they?" "They would," he said, "if you told them what would be the consequences if they didn't." And what will the consequences be?" enquired Edna. "Well," he replied darkly, "poor Tootsie will never reach his full growth on his present diet. I fancy he would rather relish a change." "You couldn't see me you were once engaged to, devoured by your horrible dragon!" she cried. "Why not?" he asked cheerfully. "I am great enough now to be able to bear the sight of others' pain, as you learned what's-his-name said I ought to be." "Listen," said the unhappy Edna. If I write this letter, will you promise me, on your sacred word of honour, to become a vegetarian at once?" "Certainly," he said. "It won't bind me, you know. You might put in a letter that I've promised to. Rather a good touch. Now go and write it at once, and I'll send Tootsie over with it. You can say, 'Please send answer by bearer.' Xuriel, show the Princess to a chamber and provide her with writing materials." "If your Royal Highness will graciously come this way," said the despicable Xuriel, bowing low. Poor Edna had to follow him up a steep outside staircase to a gloomy room where deep-set windows commanded a view of the courtyard below. He found some sheets of parchment and a reed pen, and lent her the inkhorn from his own girdle. As he was depositing these on a great oaken table, he glanced out of the window and gave a high, cackling laugh. "I fear my venerable and respected friend, the worthy Court Godmother, must have met with some mishap," he sniggered. "For see, Princess, her dove chariot has just descended without its gracious occupant, on the roof of the bastion. He he! I sincerely trust that Tootsie may not so far forget himself as to snap up any of those dear little doves." And so saying, he hurried to the courtyard. Edna was naturally concerned at any possible accident to the Court Godmother or her doves, but her letter had to be written, and it was not at all an easy letter to write. She got as far as, "Dear Father and Mother, you will be relieved to hear that I am, so far, unhurt, but—" and there she stuck. It was really very difficult to find any plausible wording for the ogre's preposterous terms. Xuriel had rejoined his patron, and both were watching Tootsie with interest. He had already become aware of the doves, and reared his head above the level of the bastion roof, where they were strutting about unsuspicious of danger. His hideous lidless eyes regarded them intently, with a view to selecting the plumpest bird. "Those pigeons will be quite a treat for poor Tootsie," remarked Count Rubenfresser. "But what is that thing flashing there on the roof? There it is again. Can't you see it?" Xuriel looked, and saw a thin, scintillating ray of light which shifted capriciously from place to place. "It is the blade of a sword," he said. "More, it is the blade of the enchanted sword I sold to Prince Clarence." "Fool!" said the Count. "How can any sword be there with no hand to wield it?" "The Crown Prince is wielding it," replied Xuriel. "He is rendered invisible by the magic cap I made for the Court Chamberlain." "You had no business to make such things," returned the Count. "They were very properly forbidden. But Tootsie will very soon—" Before he could say more, there was another flash, a sweeping circle of light, and Tootsie's head flew from his neck, which sent up a column of blood. "The wretch!" shrieked the Count. "The cruel, cold-blooded wretch! He's killed my Tootsie!" "It will be our turn next!" cried the little Astrologer Royal, too terrified to stir. "Help!" the Count bawled. "We're attacked! Where are you all?" A few retainers had run out to various doorways at his summons, but when they saw the dragon's great body rolling convulsively round the courtyard, its hooked wings thrashing up the cobblestones, while its head bounded independently about, barking and snapping like a mad dog, they very prudently withdrew. Xuriel had recovered strength to run, but he had not gone far before the head, probably quite automatically, seized his right calf and brought him down. There was another sharp glint of light, and his body was headless, like the dragon's. What with the endeavour to avoid Tootsie's head and Tootsie's body, and the terrible sword flashes, all at once, the Count was kept pretty busy for the next minute or so. He rushed, leaping and yelling, roaring and dodging, from side to side and corner to corner, and then made a frantic bolt for the outer staircase, but it only got halfway up when his head fell with a splash into a water butt below, while his body slid down to the bottom of the steps, where it lay in a limp, crumpled heap. The noise of all these proceedings was not exactly conducive to literary composition, and Princess Edna had already been obliged to abandon her letter. In fact, she had begun to realize that it would no longer be necessary to finish it. Her brother, she thought, had come to her deliverance with a promptness and energy which she would really have hardly expected of him. She put on her pince nez again and went out to the head of the staircase. "Clarence!" she called. "Where are you?" She was immensely surprised to encounter a plain young man in homely costume whom she had certainly never seen before. Mirliflor, who had just removed his cap and was springing up the steps in search of Daphne, was at least equally surprised at finding Edna. "You here, Princess?" he cried breathlessly. "Tell me, is Daphne safe?" "If you refer to Miss Heritage," replied Edna, "I've not seen her for weeks, but I have no reason for believing that she is not safe in England." "Then," he said blankly, "the dragon carried off you, not her." "I should have thought that fairly obvious," said Edna frigidly. "You have evidently rescued me under a misapprehension, though of course I am just as much indebted to you, and I shall be glad to know who you are. In answering, kindly address me as Your Royal Highness. It is more correct." This was highly embarrassing, he thought, though he felt thankful that his godmother had not had time to make him recognizable. "My name, Your Royal Highness," he replied, "is Giroflé. I have the honour to be one of His Majesty's under-gardeners." "Oh," said Edna, "one of them? Really? Well, you've behaved most creditably, very creditably indeed. I really don't know what mightn't have happened if you hadn't arrived just then. I've never been in such a trying situation before. And, even as it is," she added, "there doesn't seem to be any means of getting out of this odious place." By this time Tootsie's death throes were over. His body lay extended half across the courtyard, while the head, after having bitten one or two of the carriage horses rather severely, had also ceased from troubling. "Perhaps," said Mirliflor, "Your Royal Highness will condescend to make use of the dove car which brought me here. It will carry you back in safety to the palace." "It looks rather tituppy," said Edna, as the doves flew down with it at his call. "And it only holds one. How are you going to get away yourself?" "I shall order some of those varlets to open the gate," he said, "and they will be wise to obey." "Clarence's sword is a great help," said Edna. "Then you'll be all right. And you may be sure that His Majesty will pay you a suitable reward." "The satisfaction of having been of any service to your Royal Highness," he said, "is reward enough in itself." "Oh, but that's such a pose!" said Edna. "Of course you expected to be paid for it, and you will be. Must I tell these birds where to take me? I see. Then, home, please!" And the doves, glad to escape from such uncongenial surroundings, whirred upwards with the car, and, after a few tentative circles, took it clear over the battlements. As for the retainers, they waited for no order to unbar the gate for Mirliflor, being all eagerness to facilitate his departure. He strode unconcernedly out, and, finding a party of the royal guard outside, he informed them that they would find 1 or 2 severed heads within, if they cared to collect them. And then, borrowing a charger, he galloped off to Eswarenmal, impatient to know what had befallen Daphne. On the palace terrace there had been a period of painful surprise. The Crown Prince was the first of the rescue party to return. He would have much preferred to do so by a back way, but, perceiving that he had been observed, took the manlier course. "Clarence!" shrieked the Queen, as he limped up with his breastplate and hose covered with mire, a bent sword and a badly dinted helmet. "Is she saved?" "Couldn't tell you, mater," he replied heavily. "I've done all I could, and so I came back." "He's wounded!" cried Ruby tearfully. "Oh, Clarence, was it that horrid Tootsie?" For she was effectually disillusioned at last. "No, Kitty, no," he said. "I'm all right. Took a bit of a toss, that's all." "My poor boy," said his mother. "Was it at the castle? Did the thing attack you?" "I never got to the castle," he replied. "Only about half-way. It was like this. That bally pendant you made me wear, mater, got unfastened somehow, slipped down inside my breastplate, and was hurting like the very deuce. So I got off and unbuckled a bit and pitched it away. When I got on again, the horse was all over the shop with me in a jiffy. Couldn't hold him for toffee. And before I knew it, I was over the brute's head. I tried to mount again, but he wouldn't let me. I tried some other G's, and none of them would. Somehow I seemed to have lost the knack all at once. So, after I'd come off once or twice more and was getting a trifle lame, I thought the best thing I could do was to leg it home." Said his father. "Rather unfortunate thing to happen just now, my boy." "Well, Governor," he replied, "I should never have got there in time walking." "You were quite right to come back, Clarence," said his mother. "And oh, look, look!" she cried suddenly. "Our darling is safe after all. She's coming back in the dove car." The car landed shortly after on the terrace, and Edna was frantically embraced and plied with questions. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she said as soon as she had an opportunity of speaking. "Of course it was a most disagreeable thing to happen to one, and I don't feel equal to talking about it just yet, but I am very little the worse for it now." "But how did you get that awful man to let you go?" inquired the Queen. "He couldn't very well help himself. His head had been cut off. So had the dragons, and that abominable little wretch Curios too." By this time not only the Marshal, but the Court Godmother and the Chamberlain had joined the party. "But who was brave enough to do all this?" asked the Queen. "Though I think I can guess." "I fancy he said he was one of the under gardeners here. Of course he couldn't have done it without Clarence's sword, but still—" "I never lent him it," said Clarence. "If I'd had it. However, perhaps it's as well he did borrow it. Jolly plucky of the beggar, I call it." "He behaved extremely well," Edna admitted. "You'll have to reward him or something, Father." "His Majesty," said the Marshal with a certain gusto, "has already offered your Royal Highness's hand in marriage to whomsoever should be so fortunate as to effect your deliverance." "Without consulting me?" cried Edna. "Really, Father, these things aren't done nowadays. It's too absurd." "My love," said the Queen, with a glance of secret intelligence at the embarrassed Baron, who looked another way, "the circumstances were exceptional, and the King can't go back on his word. Besides, this ex-gardener may be not such a common person as he seems. May he not, Baron?" "But dash it, Mater," said Clarence, while the Baron could only blink. "An under gardener? What?" "I'm bound to say," began the King, when the Queen interrupted. "You are bound to say that you'll keep your promise, Sidney, and that is enough, till the dear fellow comes to claim his reward." It was the Marshal whose superfluous zeal led him to order Giroflé to be stopped and brought into the Royal presence as soon as he arrived at the Palace. The Royal family, with the Court Godmother, the Baron, and other members of the household, had assembled in the throne room when the Marshal entered, leading the reluctant Giroflé, acutely conscious of looking his very worst. After him came some men-at-arms, who carried the dragon's still terrific head, with those of the Count and Xuriel, as trophies of the hero's exploit. They caused a general but by no means unpleasant shudder to run through the beholders. "Your Majesties," said the ex-regent, "I have the honour to present the gallant youth who has nobly earned even such a prize as the hand of our Royal Highness." But," stammered Queen Selina, "this isn't... there's not the least resemblance. Baron, what did you mean by telling me that the Prince..." I must have been misinformed, your Majesty," said the Court Chamberlain, having no better explanation to offer. "You should be more careful about what you tell us, Baron," said the Queen. "And really, there was no need to bring those dreadful heads into our throne room, making all that horrible mess. It's a piece of bad taste which, perhaps, in an under gardener... Please have them removed directly. Well, young man," she continued to the indignant Mirliflor, who, it need not be said, had nothing to do with the gruesome introduction of the heads, "I'm sure we are all very much obliged to you. Very much obliged indeed. If you hadn't come forward as you did, it's dreadful to think what might have happened. And, though it seems you did take the liberty of borrowing the Crown Prince's sword without permission, we are the last to blame you for that. We think you are entitled to be very handsomely rewarded. But if you're expecting our daughter, the Princess Edna's hand, I think your own good sense..." "Yes, yes," said the King. "Mustn't open your mouth too wide, you know. There's a limit to all things. And a round sum of money with which you could start in business and marry some nice little woman in your own class of life will be far more useful to you." "I ask for no reward," said Giroflé, "and the hand of a Princess is an honour to which I do not aspire, since I am already affianced." "That," replied the Queen, "is very satisfactory. We shall certainly send the young person a wedding present. Who is she? One of the royal kitchen maids, I presume?" "She was in your Majesty's service as a lady in waiting," he said, "and her name is Daphne." "Oh," said Queen Selina, "really? Miss Heritage? Well, you are to be congratulated, I'm sure." "But, Mater," said Clarence, "it can't be her. I thought you had had her sent home." "I had made arrangements for her return, Clarence, but it seems to have been postponed for some reason. Luckily, as things have turned out. She has been given rooms in a pavilion behind the Palace Gardens, where no doubt she managed to become acquainted with this young man." "And he may take it," said the Fairy, "that the Lady Daphne is at liberty to depart with him at once." "Certainly," said the Queen. "It is hardly, perhaps... but Miss Heritage is no doubt right in accepting the first offer she receives." "Quite," said Princess Edna, "though it seems odd, even for a governess, to think of marrying a gardener. But I'm sure I wish her every happiness." There is no doubt that the Court Godmother should have been content with this, but her anger and disgust were too much for her discretion. She could not resist the temptation to humiliate and confound these upstarts by a sensational stroke, whatever it cost her. "Perhaps," she said, "the Lady Daphne has made a wiser choice than any of you may imagine." With this, after muttering an incantation, she touched Giroflé with her crutch-handled staff, and in his stead Prince Mirliflor stood revealed in rich and splendid attire before them all. The Queen was electrified for a moment, as were Edna and most present, but as soon as the shock had passed, she cried, "This is a surprise! But, my dear Prince Mirliflor, why didn't you tell us who you were before? You see, we couldn't possibly..." "It was really too naughty of you to play us such a trick, Prince," said Edna, "when, as you might have known..." "Never mind," purred the Queen. "We'll forgive him. Won't we, Edna?" "Of course you only said that about Miss Heritage to tease us," said Edna, who really believed it was so. "I said but the truth, Princess," he replied. "She has promised to be my wife." "And the match," put in the triumphant Fairy, addressing Queen Selina, "already has your sanction." "Oh," said the Queen, "but that was before... I think," she went on with a forced smile of much sweetness, "I think you and I, my dear Court Godmother, must have a little talk over this in private before I can make up my mind what I ought to do. Perhaps you will be kind enough to follow me to my cabinet. Excuse my deserting you for a little while, my dear Mirliflor. I shall leave you to Edna, who, I know, is dying to express all the gratitude and admiration she feels." and she swept with great stateliness out of the throne room towards her cabinet, the Court Godmother following with a presentiment that her pet scheme was about to encounter some opposition, and no very definite idea how to meet it. But that it must and should be overcome somehow she was thoroughly determined. It should be mentioned here that, shortly after his transformation, Mirliflor found inside his rich doublet something which proved to be the Chamberlain's cap. He was about to return it, but the Baron showed so little desire to receive his property in public that the Prince decided to keep it until a better opportunity presented itself. And then he forgot all about it, for which, as things turned out, both had reason to be thankful afterwards. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 18. A Previous Engagement. "Well, my dear Court Godmother," began the Queen, as she sank on an ivory and cloth of gold settee in her private cabinet, and cooled her somewhat heated face with a jewelled ostrich-feathered fan, "I had better tell you frankly that I think both you and that designing little adventuress have behaved in a very underhand way in this business, a way that I naturally resent. Mirliflor, as you very well know, came here on darling Edna's account, and you deliberately threw that Miss Heritage in his way. I haven't the least doubt you told her who he really was." "That," said the Fairy, "is just what I did not do. It was part of the test I put to her. She still has no idea that he is more than a student." "Well, you egged her on to set her cap at him, and if he cares for her at all, it can be no more than a passing fancy. I cannot be a party to letting the poor dear young fellow be entrapped into a mésalliance to please you, and I shall see that she is sent back to England at once, as but for you she would have been long before this." "I don't want to lose my temper with you if I can help it," said the Fairy, with an ominous flush on her peaked old nose, "because I've been through a good deal as it is this morning, and I'm feeling very far from well in consequence. But you had better understand that Lady Daphne is not going to be sent back to England. She is going with Mirliflor and me to Clairdelune, and we shall start immediately. You are at liberty to go where you please, but Miss Heritage will certainly not leave the Palace except to return to her own country." "And I tell you I intend to take her to Clairdelune with me, and you are powerless to prevent it." "Indeed!" said the Queen, in high wrath. "Answer me this. Am I Queen of Maerchenland, or am I not?" "You are not," retorted the Fairy, before she could prevent herself, for the opening was really too tempting. She had not meant to go so far, but, having started, she proceeded to enlighten the Queen as to her title, and the very slender evidence on which it was based. "I don't believe a single word of it," declared Queen Selina, as defiantly as if this were the fact. "It's a wicked plot to set up my own governess as a pretender, but there's a very short way of settling that. I shall send for the Marshal." And she made a movement towards a handbell of exquisitely engraved crystal with a sapphire tongue. "I shall tell him what you have dared to say, and have you and that wretched girl arrested as traitors." The Fairy shook with mingled fury and fear, for she saw too late that she had made a wrong move. "Before you do that, listen to me," she said. "All I have said is true, and you know it is true, but it was you who forced me to say it, and I am willing to be silent so long as you permit me to convey Lady Daphne to Clairdelune. And she has no suspicion of her claims to the throne. You need have no fear that she will assert them." "I can't trust either of you. You are much too dangerous," said the Queen, and she rang the bell. "You had better take my warning," said the Fairy, her wrinkled mouth working with passion. "Old as I am, I have some powers left that you little suspect. Scarce an hour ago I changed myself into a pool and Lady Daphne into a cypress." She naturally omitted to add how narrowly they had escaped having to remain so indefinitely. "And by aid of the same spell I could transform you to a shape which you will discover after I have caused you to assume it, and it is a shape that you will not Like." "Pooh!" said the Queen, on whom the reintegration of the under gardener into Mirliflor seemed to have left little impression. "Either you're trying to frighten me or you're crazy. Whichever it is, you ought to be put under restraint, and I shall see to it that you are." "After that, I'll do what I threatened," snarled the Court Godmother. "It may kill me, but I don't care. I'll do it." And she mouthed words of mystic sound and import, though her jaw trembled so violently that she could scarcely pronounce them. "Now," she concluded, pointing her crutch at the Queen's breast, become a—" But what the Queen was to become never transpired, for before the infuriated Fairy could manage to name it, her features suddenly became contorted, the stick fell from her hand, and she sank down in a heap just as the attendants entered in answer to the royal summons. "I'm afraid," said Queen Selina, "that the Court Godmother has fainted. I dare say it's nothing serious. Still, one of you had better bring the royal apothecary at once. Be careful to keep it from the Court, as I wish to avoid unnecessary alarm." The others endeavoured to restore the afflicted Fairy, but though still alive, she was in some kind of cataleptic condition which was beyond the ordinary remedies. The Court apothecary arrived and applied blisters without result, and finally gave it as his opinion that, while she might survive for some time, she would in all probability never speak again. So Queen Selina ordered her to be removed to her apartments, and the fact that she was indisposed to be suppressed for the present, after which she left her cabinet, feeling that Providence had been more than usually judicious. Her next step was to send for the Marshal and instruct him to remove Daphne from the pavilion to a chamber in one of the palace towers, where she was to remain a prisoner under his guardianship. "It's only for a short time, Marshal," she said, "and of course you will see that Miss Heritage is made thoroughly comfortable." And then, the ground having been thus cleared, she returned to the throne room. "Just a moment or two, my dear Mirliflor," she said suavely, "if Edna can spare you." And she drew him aside. "Well," she began, "I've been telling the dear old Court Godmother the difficulty I am in. You see, I would willingly recognise this engagement of yours, whatever I may think about it, if I only could. But really, you know, I can't possibly allow you to take Miss Heritage away until I am satisfied that your dear father approves of her as a daughter-in-law. As her employer, I feel responsible for the poor girl. And besides, he might think I had encouraged this match, and I can't afford to put myself in such a false position as that." "But," he objected, "my godmother is going with us to Clairdelune, and she will explain all." "She has altered her plans," said the Queen, who was developing a quite unsuspected talent for diplomacy. "To tell you the truth, I fancy she's getting a little nervous about how King Tournesol may take what she has done. She feels, as I am afraid I do, that it is wiser to keep dear Miss Heritage here under her own care till you have broken the news to your father and obtained his consent." "My father is certain to consent," said the Prince, "and if he did not—" "Oh, quite so, quite so. But both your godmother and I consider that we ought to wait till he does consent. Of course, if you can bring us a letter from him stating that he approves, all will be well. I'm sure you must quite understand that that is really as far as I can go under the circumstances. And, if you start at once, you'll be back here again in a very few days, bringing, I hope, a favourable answer. We shall be most pleased to lend you any horse you like in the royal stables." She was so plausible that poor Mirliflor, who, like most fairy princes, was not very deeply versed in feminine wiles, was quite taken in. He thought her lacking in distinction for a queen, but well-meaning. And it was so like his godmother to impose one more test on him. "I will set forth, then," he said, "as soon as I've seen my Daphne and assured her of my speedy return." "I'm afraid, my dear Mirliflor," said Queen Selina, "I'm afraid you can't see her before you go." "And why not?" he asked. "Well, you see, the dear Court Godmother, mistakenly, I think, has told her what a great person you really are, and Miss Heritage feels that she has not the right to see you again unless and until she can hear that she will be welcomed at your father's court. I said all I could to show her that she need not be so over scrupulous as that, but she is such an extremely sensitive girl, and feels her social inferiority so acutely that nothing would persuade her to alter her resolution. You will only be distressing her by attempting it." He pleaded and argued as long as he could, but eventually he was convinced that it was in vain. And so, as he knew that Daphne would be safe under the Fairy's protection, he took his leave, and, choosing the best horse in the royal stud, set out on his journey to Clairdelune. By so doing, he was only, little as he suspected it, giving his hostess time to consider how she could best deal with the girl who, she no longer doubted, was the rightful possessor of the throne. But then Miss Heritage was not aware of her birthright, which seemed to suggest more than one way of coping with the situation. After Queen Selina and her royal consort, with the Crown Prince and the Princess Edna and Ruby, had waved their last adieus to the departing Mirliflor, the Marshal approached Clarence. "Allow me, sire," he said, "to restore this jewel, which was picked up close to the spot where your Royal Highness's steed became so suddenly and unaccountably unmanageable." Clarence reddened, for there was a covert sneer in the ex-regent's tone which he did not like, while he was angrily conscious that it was quite undeserved. "Oh, thanks, Marshal," he said, as he took the pendant. "I say, Mater, no wonder the bally thing slipped down. The clasp's worn out. Whoever you bought it from ought to have put in a proper repair before he sold it. Pity you can't send it back and make him mend it." "Do I understand," inquired the Marshal of the Queen, "that your Majesty bought this pendant?" "Certainly not," replied the Queen, flushing in her turn. "You're mistaken, Clarence. It has been in the family for years." "You're mixing it up with something else, Mater," he said. "Don't you remember? You wore it for the first time that evening the Baron came to fetch us. And you told us you'd bought it out of old Uncle Wibberley's legacy. I'm sure I'm right." "That was a different ornament altogether," said his mother. "But it's not worth discussing." Accordingly the subject was dropped for the time, at all events, though the Marshal did not forget it. His was not a brilliant intellect, brilliant intellects being rare in Maerchenland, but he had the faculty of putting two and two together and inferring that the total was more likely to be about 4 than any other number. The Astrologer Royal had predicted that the Queen would be discovered in a certain spot in England and would be identified by being the possessor of Prince Chrysopras's jewel, but the Marshal was now satisfied that she was the possessor by purchase only. The original owner, if Xuriel had read the stars correctly, was in the same locality. Was it not possible that Lady Daphne might be that owner? If so, it would explain the Queen's motive for placing her under arrest. Marshal Federhelm resolved to play a bold stroke. When in the course of his office he had next to visit his prisoner, whom he had made a point of treating with all courtesy, she begged him to tell her what fresh offence she had given that she should have been condemned to solitary imprisonment. "I know but this," said the Marshal. "Her Majesty is displeased at finding that a certain jewel she purchased from you is of less value than she had been led to believe." "But, Marshal," protested poor Daphne, naturally imagining that the Queen had been complaining to him of the transaction, "surely it's worth at least £30. If it isn't, I'd willingly take it back and return the money. Only I can't, because I used it all to pay my bill. But I always thought that pendant was valuable, and as it belonged to my father, I would never have sold it at all if I hadn't been obliged. What do you think I ought to do?" "You can do nothing, Lady Daphne," he replied, "save trust that Her Majesty's anger will pass away. For whatever price she may have paid for such a jewel, it is assuredly of far greater value than she is pleased to assert." "I'm so glad to hear you say that," said Daphne. "It would be hateful to think I had cheated Her Majesty, even though I never meant to." That was all that passed between them, but the Marshal had learned all that he wanted to know, though he made no immediate use of his knowledge. It was enough for him to feel that he had a card which he might play to his own advantage when the opportunity came. The Court Godmother was now generally known to be hors de combat, and as for the old Baron, he could be left for the present in ignorance of his blunder. Queen Selina, meanwhile, had already formed her plans. She was not a positively wicked woman, and even still thought herself irreproachable. If she had managed to separate Mirliflor and Daphne by some hard fibbing, it was only what her duty as a queen and as a mother demanded of her. She had never liked this Miss Heritage, and firmly believed that Daphne had alienated Mirliflor's affection from Edna to herself. And now it seemed she was the lawful queen of the country, and Queen Selina had grown too habituated to power and grandeur to give them up to this inexperienced girl. Her first idea had been to carry out her original intention and have Daphne sent home to England without further delay. But this, she began to see, would expose her to considerable criticism at Court, and it occurred to her that there might be a simpler and more satisfactory way out of her difficulties. So, full of her latest project, she went in search of Clarence, whom she found lounging with a very moody and disconsolate air in one of the balconies. Clarence was in low spirits just then, and not without reason. He had entirely lost his nerve for horsemanship, as his mounts had become as refractory as ever. He could not help perceiving that the courtiers had lost all respect for him, and received his overtures with hardly veiled impertinence. And besides all this, there was another matter that had been weighing on his mind for some time past. "Why, Clarence, dear boy," she began, "what are you keeping away from everybody like this for?" "I wasn't keeping away that I know of," he said. "There are times when a fellow's glad to get a quiet moment to himself, that's all." "Perhaps," she said, "I know the real reason why you've been so mopey lately." "What do you mean, Mater?" he asked. "You haven't—" "My dear Clarence, do you think I can't see that you've never got over your fondness for little Miss Heritage? I can't bear to see you looking so unhappy, and I've come to think that I may have been wrong in keeping her out of your way. So, and this is what I came to tell you, if you feel that she is necessary to your happiness, I shall not oppose you any longer, and I will see that your father doesn't." "I wish you'd said so before, Mater," he replied. "The governor's been at me to propose to old Golden and Bergenland's daughter, but I had to tell him I couldn't take it on." "Of course not, dear. I'm told she's hideous. While Miss Heritage, at all events—" "But she's engaged to Mirliflor. Lucky chap he is to get her too. I might have once, if I'd had the pluck." "You may get her still, dear boy," said his fond mother. "You see, she doesn't know who Mirliflor is yet. She thinks he's a student or something, pretending to be a gardener. Well, she's much too clever a little person not to get out of such an engagement as that if she knew she could be the Crown Princess." Which was no more than Queen Selina actually believed. "Trust me, Clarence," she concluded. "You've only to ask." "I dare say you're right, Mater," he said. "Only the worst of it is, I'm not free to ask her." "Not free? What do you mean?" "I didn't like to tell you before," he said, "but, well, I've gone and got engaged to someone else." "Engaged? Who to?" demanded the Queen, in her own English. "If it's anyone in my court—" "It's no one you know, Mater. But she's all right, you know. At least, she's a king's daughter of sorts. Her father's king of the Crystal Lake." "The Crystal Lake?" said Queen Selina. "You wretched boy! Don't tell me you're engaged to a water nixie." "Well, I suppose that's what it amounts to," he said. "I never wanted to be. I met her when I was fishing there. She came up out of the water, and we got talking and that, and I told her who I was. And after that, whenever I got to the lake, she was always popping up. I thought she was rather a jolly sort of girl, if she was a trifle on the damp side, and it amused me to talk to her. But I never said a word to her that could... till her old dad suddenly turned up and insisted on our being regularly engaged." "And you gave way? Oh, Clarence, how could you be so weak?" "I told him I'd see him blowed before I said yes, and he pulled me in and threatened to hold my head under water till I promised," said Clarence. "I didn't see any point in being drowned, and so, sooner than have a row about it, I did say yes. What else could I say?" "Well," said the Queen, "no engagement made under such circumstances can be binding, and you must break it off at once. Go and tell him that your father and I refuse to hear of your engagement." "It'll make him most awful ratty if I do," objected Clarence. "What if it does? Clarence, you must get free. I'm extremely anxious that you should marry Miss Heritage before Mirliflor returns, if he does return for her. It's most important for your sister's sake, because When he finds himself forsaken, he is sure to turn to Edna again. Now do you see?" "I see," he replied lugubriously, "and I don't mind going to the lake and trying to get the old boy to let me off, but I bet you he won't." "Don't ask him anything. Simply inform him that your parents decline to allow such a match, and refer him to us." "Perhaps that would be the neatest way out of it," he agreed. "Yes, I'll just tell him that, from a safe distance, and he can do what he jolly well pleases. But it won't be a pleasant job, what?" It was some miles to the Crystal Lake, but he went on foot without any member of his suite in attendance, and in a plain cloak and slouched hat, which prevented him from being recognized as he passed through the streets of the capital. During his absence, his mother was engaged in long and anxious consultation with the King and Edna. "I'm surprised at Clarence," King Sidney had observed. "Thought he knew his way about too well to be drawn into an entanglement of this kind." "He never would have been," said his mother, "if he hadn't had to choose between that and being held under water. And you can trust Clarence to make it clear that he would not be allowed to keep such a promise, even if he wanted to." "If he marries anyone," said the King, "it ought to be this Princess of Golden and Bergenland. He'll get money with her, and he wants some rather badly." "Pardon me, Sidney," said the Queen, "but I intend him to marry Miss Heritage." "Mother!" exclaimed Edna. "Miss Heritage! What can you be thinking of?" "I know what I am doing, my love. The poor boy is devoted to her, and always has been, and in short, I have decided that he shall have his way. It will be to your advantage that he should." On reflection Edna saw this. Mirliflor might feel mortified for a time, but there was at least a chance of catching him on the rebound. When Clarence returned later, his entrance was hailed with an interrogatory "Well?" from his family. "Well," he replied, "I interviewed the old King. Told him you couldn't stick my marrying his daughter. He took it very quietly, better than I expected. All he said was that if you would come to the big fountain in the Palace Gardens, it's supplied from the Crystal Lake, you know, at sunset, he'd be there and let you know his terms." "Wants to blackmail us, does he?" said the King. "He won't get a farthing out of me." "It is like his impudence," added the Queen. "Still, it may be as well to see him." And just before the sun's final disappearance, the four stood on the margin of a small artificial lake, from the centre of which a great column of water shot up to a colossal height against the crimson and orange sky. "He doesn't seem to have kept his appointment," said the King. "Thought better of it, eh?" As he spoke, the tall column sank and resolved itself into a solid grey-green figure of little above the average stature, a long-bearded elderly personage in a flowing mantle which only partially covered his suit of glittering iridescent scales. "There is the old blighter," whispered Clarence. "This is my father and mother, sir," he added aloud, "and anything you've got to propose must be settled with them." "O King and Queen of Maerchenland," said the Lake King, in a voice like the roar of a cataract, "is it true that ye consider a daughter of mine unworthy to wed your son?" "Without entering into personalities," replied King Sidney, "which are better avoided at all times, I may say that an alliance with a family whose nature is so amphibious could not be seriously entertained by any civilized monarch." "It would be too grotesque," said Queen Selina, "even in a country like this." "I have set my heart on becoming the father-in-law of a prince of the royal blood," said the Lake King, "and I will not be denied." Now," protested King Sidney, "what is the good of taking that tone? If we were in England, I should say this was a matter that could be settled in a few minutes by our respective solicitors. As it is, you had better tell us how much you'll take to compromise it. I don't admit that your daughter has suffered any material damage. Still, if you're reasonable in your ideas of compensation, you'll find us disposed to meet you as far as we can, you know. As far as we can," he added hastily, as he remembered his shrunken gold sacks. "My terms are these," the Lake King answered. Unless the betrothal of Prince Clarence to my daughter Farewell be proclaimed throughout the city before nightfall, the waters of the crystal lake shall overflow and submerge the whole land to the tops of the highest houses. It is for ye to choose." "That would be an outrageous thing to do if you could do it," said the Queen. "But you know very well you can't." "Can I not?" retorted the Lake King. "Behold if I have boasted vainly or not." And he waved his sceptre, which was surmounted by a crystal fish. Instantly the artificial lake came pouring over its marble border, and the royal family were ankle deep in water. "It's no good," said King Sidney, as the flood spread and threatened to rise higher still. "We've got to give in." "Nothing but the safety of our poor subjects would make me consent," declared the Queen. "But as it is, I must. Stop this horrid flood, and we'll agree to everything." The water flowed back into the basin at the motion of the Lake King's sceptre. "It is agreed, then," he said, smiling for the first time, "that the betrothal is to be proclaimed before nightfall, and that the nuptials shall take place within 8 days?" "Oh, very well," said Queen Selina pettishly. "I can't think your daughter will ever settle down or be really happy with us, but that is her affair, and I will try my best to be a mother to her." "It is enough," said the King of the Crystal Lake. "I have your word. Should you retract now, what follows will be upon your own heads." And with these parting words he merged into a column of water which towered up as before, its spray falling like a fine bronze dust against the now purple sky. "I don't much think I shall ever get on with him," was all Clarence could find to say as they walked back with wet feet. "But Farewell, well, she really isn't at all bad looking in her way." "Has she got the same coloured hair as her father?" inquired Edna. "It's green," he confessed, "but a much prettier shade of green. Eau de Nil, I should call it." "And I suppose all the furniture will have to be covered in oilskin," went on Edna. "One of the delights of having a Nixie for a sister-in-law." "You needn't talk," he said angrily. "You came jolly near giving me a bally ogre for a brother-in-law, what?" "There's just this difference, Clarence," replied his sister. "I was able to break it off, which you are not." "Well, if I'm not, it's not my fault, so you needn't nag," he said savagely, for the thought that all hope of Daphne was now irretrievably lost had just begun to gall him. "We shall all have to change our shoes when we get in," was her answer, "and it's lucky if we escape a bad cold in the head. But I dare say," she added sweetly, "that when dear Farewell is one of us, we shall soon grow inured to damp." "What I'm thinking of," said the King sombrely, "is how the Court and the populace will take this business. It is to be hoped that the Lake King is liked in these parts." "Who could help loving him?" jeered Edna. "No doubt the wedding will excite the greatest enthusiasm, especially if the bride goes through the ceremony in a tank." "Oh, shut up, can't you?" cried the worried Clarence. "Don't make it out more rotten than it is." Queen Selina was too occupied with her own reflections to interfere. Her plan for securing the succession to the throne by a union between Clarence and Daphne was clearly no longer practicable. She had been anxious to treat the girl with consideration and even indulgence, but events had made this impossible. It was absolutely necessary now to get Miss Heritage safely out of the way as soon as it could be managed. "I must speak to the Marshal about it," she was thinking, "and have her sent back to England in that stork car. The poor dear Court Godmother is much too ill to be consulted just now. I have just that much to be truly thankful for." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 19. Servants of the Queen. If breaking the news of Edna's engagement to Count von Rubenfresser had been a matter of some delicacy, to inform the court and public of Clarence's betrothal to a water nixie was, as his parents felt, infinitely more so. Queen Selina told the Baron first, but, rather to her surprise, He took it calmly and almost apathetically. "I'm afraid, Baron," she said, "you will think it very weak of us to allow it, but between ourselves there are state reasons which left us no choice." To which he replied that he would much prefer to be excused from offering any opinion as to the policy their Majesties had chosen to pursue. The Marshal, on the other hand, expressed cordial satisfaction. His lizard-like eyes sparkled as he assured his Sovereigns that he would see that the heralds proclaimed the betrothal in the city before nightfall, and that he expected it would excite heartfelt enthusiasm. It certainly had not that effect on the Court. The ladies-in-waiting resented the prospect of having to acknowledge a new royalty, the greater part of whose existence had been spent under water. The courtiers shrugged their shoulders with sardonic resignation. In vain the Crown Prince attempted to carry off his secret uneasiness by clapping them on the back and saying, "You haven't seen Princess Forelle yet, you know, my dear boy. When you do, you'll agree that she's a regular little ripper, what?" They made it sufficiently clear that they had no wish to see the future Crown Princess. In fact, if he had not already lost all the prestige he had ever had, he would have lost it now, and his feelings were not to be envied. Marshal Federhelm requested a private audience from the Queen, who received him in her cabinet. He began by asking permission to absent himself for a few days on a hunting expedition in the forest, which permission was graciously accorded. "If the Crown Prince had not ties to keep him at home," she added, "I'm sure he would be delighted to join you." "I doubt it, your Majesty," said the Marshal. "His Royal Highness's ardour for such pursuits has languished much of late. However, he is better employed, and ere I leave I must ask your Majesty's wishes in regard to my prisoner, the Lady Daphne." "Ah, I was going to talk to you about that, Marshal," said Queen Selina. "There are many reasons why it is undesirable that Miss Heritage should remain here any longer. After the underhand and ungrateful manner in which he has tried to pervert Prince Mirliflor from his attachment to Princess Edna, I feel it my duty to have her removed." "I understand, your Majesty," he said, "and it shall be done. But I would recommend, in your Majesty's interests, that the execution should take place in private, and that the Lady Daphne's decease should be supposed to be due to sudden illness. Otherwise there may be trouble with the Court." "Execution!" cried Queen Selina, genuinely horrified. "Good gracious me, Marshal! You don't suppose I want the poor girl put to death, do you? What do you take me for?" "It would be a prudent course," he said with meaning, "for any Sovereign to adopt in your Majesty's situation." "For a Maerchenland Sovereign, perhaps, but I have been brought up with very different ideas. I should consider it most wicked to give orders for anybody to be killed. That is not at all what I meant in saying that I want Miss Heritage removed." "Then I fail to understand, your Majesty." "It's perfectly simple. I merely wish to have her sent back to England. The Baron can take her in the Court Godmother's stork car. She'll never be well enough to know of it now, poor old soul. And the dear old Baron's so devoted to us, and has always been so anxious that Edna should marry Mirliflor, that I know I can depend on him." "If it should be known," said the Marshal, "that your Majesty had banished Prince Mirliflor's chosen bride, there would be such an outcry that it might cost you your kingdom." "Oh, do you really think that, Marshal? But it is so essential that she should be sent to England. Surely it can be managed somehow without any scandal." "There is a way, madam, if your Majesty is prepared to take it." "I'm prepared to do anything, Marshal. That is, almost anything. What do you advise?" "Your Majesty should inform the Baron that, the Court Godmother being unhappily too indisposed to act as guardian to Lady Daphne, you desire him to convey her in the stork car to Clairdelune and place her under the care of Prince Mirliflor." "But, my dear good Marshal, that's the very last thing I desire." "I know, madam, I know. But it is what he should represent to the Court and Lady Daphne, and he is more likely to do so if he believes it to be the fact. I will give him sealed instructions which he is not to open till after he is started. directing him to take her, not to Clairdelune, but to the land of her birth. Your Majesty will be good enough to write such instructions at once." "It seems simple, and yet, Marshal, I'm not quite sure," demurred the Queen. "The Baron is an old dear, but just a bit of a chatterbox. He might let the whole thing out when he gets back." "He will not get back," said the Marshal. "I know a certain drug that I will administer to the storks before the journey. It is slow to act, and will not affect them until after they have reached the country that you call England. But they will never leave it again. And then it will merely be supposed that he has acted treacherously." "I see," said Queen Selina. "Yes, I should be perfectly safe then. If there was any other way, or I didn't feel so strongly that it was really a kindness to Miss Heritage to save her from occupying a position she is so unsuited to, I really don't think I could. But I suppose I must do as you suggest." She wrote the order, which she signed and sealed and handed to him. "I shouldn't like her to be left stranded in England without any means of support, Marshal," she said. "That would be a thing I could not reconcile to my conscience. So you will kindly see that she is supplied with a sack of gold." "That will be a truly royal act of generosity," he said, "especially as I understand the number of sacks in your Majesty's treasury is by no means large just now." "I was forgetting. On second thoughts, perhaps you'd better make it a purse instead," she amended. "It will keep her while she is looking out for another situation." "No doubt. And it would be wise, I think, if your Majesty would speed her departure with your good wishes in presence of the Court." But even Queen Selina shrank from such duplicity as that. I don't think I'll see her again myself," she said. I'd rather not. It's most distasteful to me to have to deceive her at all, Marshal, and I shouldn't if it wasn't absolutely necessary in self-defence." "Your Majesty has no need to assure me of that. I entirely understand," he said. "I would recommend that you send for the Baron at once and direct him to convey Lady Daphne to Clairdelune tomorrow. Then, after I have given him the secret order, my part will be done and I shall be free to enjoy my hunting." And with that he bowed himself out. Queen Selina followed his counsel so well that the old Court Chamberlain was completely deceived. Usurper as he now knew her to be, she was, he thought, still unaware of it, and such magnanimity to her daughter's successful rival gave him a better opinion of her. After all, he could bring himself to continue in her service now that the Court Godmother's main object was attained. Like her, he had no wish to confess that he had been so mistaken as to saddle the kingdom with a bogus sovereign. So he spread the news of Lady Daphne's approaching departure with great satisfaction and the warmest eulogies of the gracious consideration Queen Selina had displayed. But even this could only partially check their disaffection, for they could not forgive her for subjecting them to the indignity of accepting a water nixie as their crown princess. After dismissing the Baron, the Queen had felt somewhat shocked at her own talent for dissimulation. "I little thought at Gablehurst that I should ever fib like this," she reflected. "But I wasn't a Queen then, and I can't afford to be too particular when it's a question of keeping the crown in the family." The Marshal waited until the Baron had concluded his interview with the Queen, and then visited him in his own quarters. The Court Chamberlain mentioned the instructions he had just received, and spoke in the highest terms of his royal mistress's benevolence. "As you say, Baron," said the Marshal, "such conduct does honour to Her Majesty. She has, however, given me further instructions for you, with which it is well you should be acquainted at once." And he drew out the secret order, and, after breaking the seal, presented the parchment to the Baron, who read it with honest amazement and indignation. "I cannot believe Her Majesty can have devised such wickedness," he said. "What can be her reason, unless... And here he checked himself. "You were about to say, unless she knows, as you and I, my dear Baron, know beyond all doubt, that the Lady Daphne is the real Queen of Maerchenland." "So you know that too?" cried the Baron, recoiling in terror. "I swear to you, my lord, that I myself had no suspicion of it until it was revealed to me by the Court Godmother but 2 days since." I accept your word for it, though whether others will do so is another matter," said the Marshal as he picked up and thrust in his doublet the document which the other had let fall. "But what I should like to know is which of your orders you intend to execute." "The first, of course!" exclaimed the Baron indignantly. "Lady Daphne has a higher claim to my fealty than this interloper. I shall do my duty and carry her to Clair de Lune." "You forget that Prince Mirliflor will not be there as yet to receive her, nor is it seemly that she should quit her kingdom without making any assertion of her claim. My plan is better than yours, Baron. Hearken, I leave the palace tonight on the pretext of hunting in the forest of Schlangenzweigen. I take with me a company of my own, all tried soldiers on whom I can rely. Tomorrow you will set out in the car as though to Clair de Lune, and Queen Selina will naturally believe that her secret order will be obeyed. But after having gone a certain distance, you will head your storks for the chapel of St. Morosius in the forest. There we shall be waiting to swear allegiance to our young Queen and escort her in triumph to Eswareinmal. I shall have taken measures beforehand to proclaim her title, and it is certain that the populace will rise in her favour. You cannot fail to see, my dear Baron, that your best, in fact, your only way of escaping the penalty of your folly, to call it by no harsher name, is to aid us in undoing it." "Enough, Marshal," said the Baron. "You can count upon me." "I'm sure of it, Baron, and as I am leaving the palace, I will deliver the Lady Daphne into your custody. See that you say nothing to her of our scheme till the fitting moment. For the present she must be told that she is to be taken to Clair de Lune. And now I must quit you, for I have much to attend to before I start, which should be within an hour. Tomorrow at midday we shall expect you at the chapel in the forest, and have a care for your own sake that you fail us not." An hour later, having disposed of the business he had attended to, and left everything in train for his project, he set out with a chosen band on his alleged hunting expedition. "Whether this will fall out as I calculate, or in some other way, I know not," he told himself, as they clattered out of one of the city gates and took the road to the forest of Schlangenzweigen. "But this I know, whatever happens, I shall shortly be King of Maerchenland." After he was gone, the Baron began to reflect on what he had undertaken, and to feel that he would be glad of an excuse to get out of it, if he could find one. It was hardly credible that Queen Selina could have devised so treacherous a plot. It seemed far more likely that the Marshal had deceived him. After all, the secret order he had been shown might not be genuine. If it were not, the Queen was innocent, and the Baron was only too willing to leave her in peaceful permission of the throne. Before he committed himself any further, he must satisfy himself on this point. His difficulty was that he could not ask her directly whether the secret order had indeed been given by her, as he might betray the Marshal, which might entail unpleasant consequences for himself. After some thought he hit upon a stratagem that was rather brilliant for him. He obtained a private interview with the Queen, and begged her to consider whether it was altogether judicious to restore Lady Daphne to a prince who might otherwise come forward once more as a suitor for Princess Edna. "Would it not be safer, madam," he suggested, "to send Lady Daphne to her own country, where he would never be able to find her?" Queen Selina was so convinced of his honesty and loyalty that she fell into his little trap without a moment's suspicion. "Now, it's really very curious you should have thought of that, my dear Baron," she said. "Very curious indeed, because I suppose the Marshal gave you a sealed letter from me before he left? I thought so, and of course it isn't to be opened till after you've started. Still, I may tell you now that it contains instructions for the very identical course you suggest. I needn't say you must be careful not to mention it, but it may be a satisfaction to you to know that I've already decided on it." "A great satisfaction indeed, your Majesty," he said, "for now my duty lies clear before me." "And nobody, I'm sure, my dear Baron, will do it more faithfully," was her gracious response. He proceeded to Daphne, who had heard that her giroflée had succeeded in his attempt to rescue Edna, but knew nothing of what had happened to him afterwards. He relieved her anxiety by informing her not only that she was to rejoin Giroflée at Clair de Lune next day, but who he actually was, which last piece of information turned all her joy to dismay. Prince or no prince, she knew that Giroflé would be true to her. But what if the king, his father, forbade him to marry anyone so far below his rank? She would have to undergo the ordeal of being presented to King Tournesol, and the thought made her heart sink with terror. "But the Court Godmother will come with me, Baron?" she asked anxiously, only to hear why this was impossible. "Too ill even to see me," said Daphne sadly, "and that is why Her Majesty is letting me be sent to Mirliflor. It's really very good of her. I suppose, Baron, I shall be able to see her and thank her before I go." "Undoubtedly," he said, and having said as much as he thought prudent, he left his prisoner to her own reflections. Most of the court gathered to see her off the next morning, but the only royalty present was little Princess Ruby, who held her former governess in close and tearful embraces. "Darling," she said through her sobs, "it's perfectly beastly to think you've been here all this time and I never knew it. And now you really are going, and I mayn't see you for ever so long. It will be so dull, for of course I wouldn't play with the gnomes now, even if they weren't all down with mumps. And Edna's so snappy, and Clarence is going to marry a nasty wet water nixie. And I wish we'd all stayed at Inglegarth, that I do." Daphne had not heard before of Clarence's engagement, and, though she naturally made no comment, she could not think he was to be congratulated on his choice. She did her best to comfort Ruby, and, after taking leave of her nearly as inconsolable friends in the household, she at length found herself seated in the car with the Baron, who had dispensed with the usual attendants. And then the courtyard, with the mass of upturned faces and waving hands, slowly sank to the rhythmical beating of the storks' wings as they obeyed the order, "To the Palace of Clair de Lune." Clarence saw the car pass overhead from the grove in the palace gardens, to which he had betaken himself in his dull misery. He knew that Daphne must be on her way to rejoin her lover, and tried to console himself by the reflection that it didn't matter to him. He was done for anyhow, whether she went or stayed. But again came the bitter thought that there had been a time when, if he had only gone the right way about it, he might have... "I thought she wasn't good enough to marry," he said to himself. "Not good enough! A girl like her! Now I'm booked to marry a Lord knows what with green hair. Serves me damn well right too." Edna also saw the car as she walked with the Queen on the terrace that commanded the city. "There goes Miss Heritage," she said. "Delighted to recapture her Mirliflor, no doubt. I don't wish to reproach you in any way, Mother, but I can't think you've shown much consideration for my interests in packing her off to him like this." It was painful to Queen Selina to be so misunderstood, but she decided that the injustice must be borne for the present. "My love," she said, "I could not possibly keep her here. And perhaps," she could not help adding, "perhaps some day you will see that I have been a better mother to you than you imagine." To which pathetic appeal Princess Edna merely responded by a short sniff, expressive rather of incredulity than any softer emotion. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 20. At the end of her tether. Both the Queen and Edna that morning had observed an unwonted stir in the usually quiet and sleepy street of Eswareinmal as they looked down on them from the terrace parapet. The great square was black with citizens, and from it rose a faint but angry drone that was unpleasantly suggestive of the results of pitching a large stone into a hornet's nest. "I expect," remarked Queen Selina, "they're all busy discussing this engagement of Clarence's. If we drive out this afternoon, we mustn't forget to take at least 2 sacks of gold with us." "I doubt if we can afford to drive out at all just now," said Edna. "Perhaps," agreed her mother, "it would be wiser to wait till things have settled down a little. Why they should get so excited about it I can't think. It's most inconsiderate and troublesome of them. At a time, too, when, goodness knows, I've enough to worry about." Just then she was chiefly harassed by a doubt whether she had been wholly wise in accepting the Marshal as a confederate, and especially in committing her secret instructions to writing. What if he knew or guessed her real reasons for getting rid of Miss Heritage? But even if that were so, he had probably acted as he had out of goodwill and desire to maintain the dynasty. He had never shown the slightest jealousy or chagrin at having been deprived of the regency. No, on the whole she thought he could be trusted to be silent, if only because he could not betray her without admitting his own complicity. Still, there was a danger that he might presume on his knowledge, which would be disagreeable enough. If their Majesties were reluctant to show themselves just then to the populace on the other hand were determined to be both seen and heard. The proclamation of Clarence's betrothal had served as the breaking strain to the attenuated links that still attached them to the throne. They had murmured against the enfranchisement of the yellow gnomes. Their deception in the matter of the self-supplying tables had weakened their loyalty seriously for a time. The projected alliance of the Princess Edna with a surviving member of a race whose scutcheon bore the taint of ogreism had aroused their bitter resentment. But all these grievances had been redressed, and the amiable easy-going Maerchenlanders were willing to forgive and forget them. Now they were called upon to put up with a humiliation beyond all endurance. The prospect of seeing the throne occupied in days to come by a creature who was not only of dubious extraction, but probably did not possess so much as the rudiments of a soul, infuriated them to madness. So much so that the royal family had scarcely finished lunch when they were startled by news that the people were once more advancing en masse up the road to the palace, and would soon be battering at the gates for admittance. "I can't see 'em," said King Sidney peevishly, plucking at his auburn moustache. "What am I to say to them about this engagement? There's nothing to say, except that it's most—" "If you say that again, Sidney," said the Queen, "I shall throw something at you. Tell them the truth." "I'd rather the Council explained it to them, my dear," he said. "The Council have been sitting tight with closed doors all the morning," said Clarence, "like a bally lot of broody hens. I don't know, of course, but I've a notion they're discussing our Republic or something." "If you won't speak to the people, Sidney," declared the Queen, with the courage of despair, "I must order the guards to close the courtyard gates, and tell the mob that, if they promise to be quiet and behave themselves, I'll come out and talk to them myself." "Good egg, Mater!" cried Clarence. "I'll come with you. It's really my show." "You'll only make them worse. Much better keep indoors and take no notice. More dignified," said the King. But as his wife and son paid no attention to him, he followed them out for very shame. As they came down the front steps and advanced to within hearing distance of the crowd, which had not attempted as yet to break through the closed gates, they were received with yells and howls of execration, frantic shaking of fists, and brandishing of improvised weapons. The strength of the gates and the presence of the guards gave the Queen more confidence than she might otherwise have felt. "Now, good people," she said in rather a tremulous voice, "it's quite impossible to speak while you're making all this noise." She had sent up for her crown, and perhaps this impressed them unconsciously, though she had been too nervous to put it on straight. Gradually silence was obtained. "I know why you've come," she began, "and we quite understand your feelings about our son's engagement. In fact, we share them." This provoked a renewal of the uproar, and a vehement desire to know why, if that were so, the union had ever been contracted. "If you'll only listen, I'll tell you," said the Queen. "We shouldn't have consented to it at all, but for the sake of our beloved people." At this the beloved people very nearly had the gates down. "You don't understand," she shouted. "Even now, if you insist on the marriage being broken off, we are quite willing. Indeed, we shall be only too happy to put a stop to it." Here there were shouts of "We do! We do insist! Stop it! No marriage!" "Very well then," said Queen Selina with more assurance. "Only I am bound to tell you what the consequences will be. The Crystal Lake will overflow till the whole of Maerchenland is under water. At least, that's what the Lake King threatens. You know best whether he can do it or not." Her hearers knew too well, and the cries and murmurs took an altered tone at once. though some voices cursed the Prince, whose weakness and folly had brought them to such a dilemma. "Weakness and folly!" cried the Queen indignantly. "How can you be so wretchedly ungrateful? When my poor, noble, unselfish boy is sacrificing himself for you don't suppose he can have any affection for a water nixie sacrificing himself on the altar of his country." "Mater," whispered Clarence in admiration, "you're the limit!" "And all the reward he gets," the Queen went on, pressing her advantage, "all the reward we get for providing that you can sleep safe and warm in your beds, instead of being drowned in them, is violence and rude remarks. Really, if you have any consciences left, you ought to be thoroughly ashamed of yourselves." They undoubtedly were. For a moment or two there was a hush, and then the whole mob broke into tumultuous cheers for the Queen, the King, and more particularly the Crown Prince. Never since their accession had the Royal Family been so popular. "There now," said the Queen, when she and her family were weary of bowing their acknowledgments, "that will do. Now go quietly away like respectable lawyer persons, and tell all the other citizens what we're doing for them." "I must say, my love," observed the King, after the crowd had melted away in a vastly different mood from that in which they had come, "you showed wonderful presence of mind. I quite thought myself we should have been massacred." "And so we should have been, Sidney," she replied, "if I'd left it to you." On re-entering the Palace, they heard that the Council was still sitting. "Let them sit!" cried Clarence. "This'll be a bit of a suck for them. What price a Republic now, eh?" "They simply daren't depose us," said the Queen, "now the dear people are with us, heart and soul." Some time later, while they were sitting in the lapis lazuli chamber, a page entered to announce that a messenger had just arrived with tidings which he wished to communicate to their Majesties in private. "Tell him to come in," said the Queen. "I do hope it isn't some fresh trouble." The messenger brought grave news. The Marshal, it appeared, had been killed while hunting in the forest. Particulars were wanting, but there was no doubt that he was dead. "How very, very sad!" exclaimed the Queen. "The poor dear Marshal! To be cut off like this in the prime of life! It must have been a wild boar, I suppose, or a bear, but whichever it was, it is a terrible loss. I don't know exactly how long the Court ought to go into mourning for an ex-regent, but at least a month." She was shocked, of course, by the suddenness of it. At the same time, she could not help a renewed sense of gratitude to Providence, which had once more gone out of its way to smooth her path. "I've always said hunting these wild animals is a very dangerous sport," said King Sidney. "Glad you've given it up, my boy." "Fed up with it, Governor. But I dare say I shall go in for it again, some day or other," Clarence replied, while he was thinking that it would have to be a day when he discovered what had become of his irresistible sword, and when he could find a horse among his numerous stud that would permit him to get on its back. They were still discussing the Marshal's untimely end when an usher came from the Hall of Council with a message that the councillors had ended their deliberations and requested their Majesties to honour them by attending to hear their decision. "I like their nerve," remarked Clarence. "Of course, Governor, you'll tell 'em they've jolly well got to come to us, what?" "No, Sidney," said Queen Selina, flushed with her recent victory. "You will say that we are coming in presently to preside over the Council and give them our advice. I shall know how to put them in their proper places. I shall wear my crown again, and you had better put on yours. And yes, I should certainly take your sceptre too." She kept them waiting as long as her own dignity demanded, and then sailed into the Council chamber, the King and Crown Prince following in her wake. The whole Council rose and remained standing until the Royal Family had taken their seats under a canopy. The President then informed them that the Councillors had resolved to use every means to prevent a union which, if contracted, would infallibly cover the entire kingdom with contempt. "Oh, very well, gentlemen," said the Queen. "I should have thought even that was better than having it covered with water. But if you in your wisdom think otherwise, we bow to your superior judgment." And she explained the situation much as she had done to the mob at the gates, though with less effect, for the President's answer was that, if such were the alternatives, their Majesties would best show their anxiety for their subjects' welfare by abdicating immediately. "I don't see that at all," she retorted. "Why in the world should we?" "Because," was the reply, "when this so-called King of the Crystal Lake learns that your son is no longer a prince, he will cease to desire him for his daughter." "And may I ask, supposing we did abdicate, whom do you propose to put in our place?" inquired the Queen. "We should appoint Marshal Federhelm as Regent once more, or even elect him Sovereign." "A very pretty plan," replied Queen Selina. "Only there's one objection to it, as you would know if you hadn't shut yourself up here all day. You'll be sorry to hear that the poor Marshal was killed this very afternoon while hunting. So you can't get him. And as there's no one else available, and as my husband and I feel that it would be very wrong to desert our dear people when they've just assured us of their perfect loyalty and affection, another fact you seem to be ignorant of, I'm afraid, gentlemen, that, whether you like it or not, you will have to put up with us." "It is true, O Queen," the President admitted with a deep groan. "We can do naught except pray that Heaven may yet save this most unhappy country from so deep a degradation." And all the other members of the Council groaned too, while several beat their breasts or tore their long white beards in senile wrath and despair. "They are a cheery complimentary lot of old devils," commented Clarence. "If I were you, Mater, I'd prorogue them." The Queen was inclined to accept this suggestion, but at that moment a loud rapping was heard at the closed doors. "Go and see who it is, somebody," she commanded. "It may be important news." She thought it probable that an attendant had come to announce the decease of the Fairy Vogelflug, which was hourly expected. The doors were partly opened, and then a voice she had never thought to hear again cried in weak and quavering accents, "Let me pass! I claim my right of admission as Court Godmother." The Queen changed colour, but felt that, inopportune as the demand was, she could not refuse it without laying herself open to suspicion, and perhaps worse. "Oh, let her come in, poor old soul," she said, "and find a seat for her. I'd really no idea she was well enough to get up." The Fairy hobbled feebly in, looking incredibly old and shrunken, and like a grim ghost of her former self in her clinging grey night-rail. Her hollow eyes glowed like live coals as she faced the Queen and stood labouring for breath before she could speak. "So glad to see you looking so much better, dear Court Godmother," said Queen Selina. "But was it wise of you to come downstairs so soon?" "I have visited the pavilion and found it untenanted," said the Fairy, without troubling to explain how she had contrived to elude her attendants and get there. "Now answer me, what have you done with Lady Daphne?" "Oh, haven't they told you?" replied the Queen. "I should have consulted you, of course, if I had known you were conscious. But as it was, I did what I thought you would wish, and sent her off with the Baron in the stork car this morning to Clairdelune." "Is this the truth? Or are you trying to deceive me by lies?" "Really," cried the Queen, "this is most uncalled for. I don't know what you suppose I've done with the girl." "You may have imprisoned, murdered her, for all I can tell. It is more likely than that you would permit her to depart so easily." "Well," said the Queen, "if you don't believe me, you have only to make inquiries. I was not in time to see her off myself, but I believe there are members of the Court who were more fortunate." Several councillors corroborated this by affirming that they themselves had not only been present, but had heard the Baron give the order to Clairdelune. "I daresay you don't think much of us, ma'am," said Clarence, "but after all, we're English, you know, and you might give us credit for playing the game, what?" He spoke with a resentment which convinced his mother of her wisdom in having played her own game without seeking any cooperation from him. The old Fairy's suspicions had been completely quelled. "I perceive," she confessed, "that I have been over ready to think evil, and can but crave your forgiveness, madam, for having done you so great an injustice." "Pray don't mention it," returned the Queen. "There was some excuse for it, and we willingly forgive you, if there's anything to forgive. And now," she added, after ordering the attendants to be fetched, "you really must take more care of yourself and get back to bed at once." "I will return to it," was the reply, "for now that my mind is at ease, I'm well content to die." "Oh, but you mustn't talk like that," protested Queen Selina, "when you've just made such a marvellous recovery. Why, you're looking ever so much brighter than any of us could have hoped. All you really need now is a good long sleep." "That is all, and I shall have it ere long. You may rest assured," she added, with a significance which the Queen alone understood, "that henceforth your peace shall not be disturbed by any word or deed of mine." The attendants entered, and she suffered them to lead her away, while King Sidney graciously extended his sceptre for her to kiss in passing, but drew it back shamefacedly on finding this civility ignored. "It's evidently the last flicker, poor old thing," said the Queen, after the Fairy had retired. "I don't at all expect we shall ever see her alive again." If she had so expected, her conscience might have troubled her more than it did. As it was, it did not reproach her too severely. It was not nice to deceive a dying person, but it was much nicer than confessing and losing a kingdom for it. It would have been too ridiculous to begin to be squeamish now. And after all, it was her misfortune rather than her fault if the family interests had necessitated a slight temporary lapse from principles she still held as rigidly as ever. She dismissed her council, which broke up in a chastened spirit, and the Royal Family, after a light meal which was the nearest approach to afternoon tea that Maerchenland afforded, went out for an airing on their favourite promenade, the terrace that overlooked Eswareinmal. The market-place was still thronged, but such sounds as reached them were no longer menacing. "I do believe they haven't done cheering for us yet," said the Queen, "and some of them seem to be waving flags. I shouldn't be the least surprised, Clarence, if your wedding next week goes off quite well after all." "I wish it would go off," he said, "but there's no chance of that now." "Well, it's no good being gloomy about it. Forelle may turn out to be charming when we come to know her. Which reminds me, dear boy, you might tell her we should be delighted if she can come to tea here some afternoon before the ceremony." "She could easily slip up through the fountain," suggested Edna. "I shall be anxious to see how she does her hair. Let me see, didn't you say it was green, Clarence?" "Oh, give her hair a rest," he replied. "I saw before we left England," said the Queen tactfully, "that green hair was going to be quite the fashion this season. But however strange she may be to society, we should remember, Edna, my love, that she will shortly become one of ourselves, and treat her with every civility. We must avoid anything that might offend her father." Queen Selina was inclined that afternoon to take a more roseate view of the future. She felt herself once more secure on the throne, now that all the dangers which had threatened to overturn it had been averted. The rival Queen would soon be landed in England, where, even if she ever heard of her rights, she would be powerless to claim them. Of the three persons who knew or might discover the truth, the Marshal was dead, the Court Godmother might just as well be so for all the harm she could do, and the Baron was on his way to a land from which he would never return. As for Mirliflor, it would not be difficult to persuade him that some blunder of the Baron's must have caused the stork cart to go astray, and it was quite possible that when the Prince had abandoned all hope of recovering Miss Heritage, he would return to Etna. "Look at the dear people now!" she cried, as she looked down on the square. "They're actually forming a procession to march up to the Palace and thank us again. Yes, they really are. It's quite wonderful the effect Clarence's self-sacrifice has had. It seems to have rallied them all round the throne. But I knew it would, if it was put to them in the right way." "Did you hear that?" she asked later, when the procession had reached an angle of the zigzag incline which was directly below. "They're shouting for me. I distinctly heard, 'We want our Queen.' So nice and warm-hearted of them." The shouts had ceased, but the tramp of thousands of feet grew louder, until the sound was deadened as the demonstrators passed under the wing of the Palace on their way to the central entrance. "Sidney, we must go in and show ourselves to them," said the Queen. "If they insist on a speech, I will make it. You always manage to say the wrong thing." As they entered the Palace, they heard a clamour which appeared to proceed from the great entrance hall. "Quite right to have asked them in," remarked the Queen with approval. "I shall order some refreshments for them, and then we can go up by a back way and appear at the top of the grand staircase." But this part of the programme was not destined to be carried out. On attempting to pass through, they were stopped, to the Queen's indignant amazement, in an inner hall by the captain of her own guards. "Really," she cried, "I never heard of such a thing. What do you mean by it?" He either could not or would not give any other explanation than that he had instructions to detain them. "Prince Hansmeinigel," said the Queen, as she saw him approaching, "can you inform us why His Majesty and I are prevented from addressing our faithful subjects?" "I think, madam," he replied smoothly, "that you would find none here to address." "How dare you tell me that, when you can hear them calling for their Queen at this very moment?" "But not for you, madam. The Queen they are demanding is the Lady Daphne." "Miss Heritage!" gasped Queen Selina. "Why should they want her?" "It seems," he said, "that certain information has reached the Burgomaster and chief citizens which has convinced them of her title to the throne, and they are now in conference with the Council on the matter." "So that treacherous old vixen of a Court Godmother had betrayed the secret after all, in spite of her promise," concluded Queen Selina. But the battle was not lost yet by any means. She was not going to give in when she had so many chances in her favour. "They might have had the decency to invite us to be present," she said. "Surely we have some right to be consulted." "They will summon you before them presently, no doubt," he said, and almost as he spoke an official came towards them and whispered to the Captain of the Guard, who turned to the Queen. "My orders are to bring you before the Council," he said, "if you will be good enough to follow me. We will go round by the outer corridor, so that you will be in no danger from the mob." "What's all this about, my dear?" whispered King Sidney, as he walked with his wife and son between a strong guard. "I thought things had quieted down again." "Oh, don't ask me, Sidney," she returned. "You will know quite soon enough. But you needn't be uneasy. I've brought you through much worse things than this." She entered the Council Hall, endeavouring to look as much like Marie Antoinette as she could. That her own Council should arraign her like this was, as she protested, most unconstitutional. They had no right whatever to do it. But however that might be, they were doing it, a fact which even she was compelled to recognise. The President began the proceedings by reciting the evidence of Daphne's title, which it now appeared had been put into the hands of the Burgomaster and other notables of Eswareinmal by the Marshal, just before he had gone to meet his sudden end. He then asked, in the name of the whole tribunal, what the present occupants of the throne had to urge in their own defence. If the Queen had possessed the legal mind, she would have perceived at once that the evidence was merely hearsay, inferences that the Marshal had drawn from what Daphne had told him, and as proofs quite worthless. But she had not a legal mind, and besides, she knew that the proofs were quite good enough for Maerchenland, also that the allegations happened to be true. So she did not attempt to deny them. "All I can say is," she declared, "that this is quite new to me. When we were brought here I was given to understand that the Kingdom had descended to me, and of course I accepted the responsibility. If there has been any silly mistake about it, you can't blame me or my husband either. We've tried to do our duty, even so far as consenting to our son's making a marriage we could not approve of, for the sake of saving our country from inundation. It's not every King and Queen who would have done that." "That peril," replied the Burgomaster, "is no longer to be feared, since the King of the Crystal Lake, on being notified of the facts in our possession, has withdrawn his demands, saying he desires no union with a family of ignoble and beggarly pretenders." "That's a let off," said Clarence. "Though he might have put it a bit more pleasantly, what?" Queen Selina felt that this repudiation had put one of her heaviest guns out of action, but she was still undaunted. "I'm sure," she said, "we have no wish to be associated with such a person, and, As for being pretenders, I can only say that if the Marshal had come to me and told me what I now know, I should have been quite ready to resign in Miss Heritage's favour. But how could I, when he never breathed a word to me about it?" "I should like to add," put in King Sidney, "that it has come as a complete surprise to me. I'm anxious to do whatever is right and proper, and if any reasonable arrangement can be come to, I won't stand in the way." This attitude produced an immediate reaction in their favour, as was visible from the expressions on the faces of the whole tribunal. "Then," the President asked, "is the Council to understand that you are prepared to resign at once?" "Certainly," said the King, "only too pleased." "Not at once," said Queen Selina. "We cannot leave the Kingdom without a ruler. That would be very wrong. But as soon as Miss Heritage, or Queen Daphne, if you like to call her so, chooses to come forward to claim the crown, we shall be delighted to give it up. Till then we are merely holding it in trust for her." "And where is Queen Daphne at present?" asked the Burgomaster. "Well," said Queen Selina, "she ought to be at Clairdelune by this time." "She must be sent for without delay," said the President, and the order was given that messengers on swift steeds should be dispatched to Clairdelune at once. "Well, gentlemen," said the Queen, after this business had been concluded, "I hope you see that you owe us an apology for daring to put us under arrest and treat us like criminals. Until Lady Daphne arrives, we are still the King and Queen of Maerchenland, and you will be good enough to regard us as such." "The Council wishes to express its deepest regret," said the President, "for having exposed your Majesty's persons to undeserved indignity." "And now, perhaps," said Queen Selina triumphantly, "we may consider ourselves free to resume our thrones, if only to dissolve the Council." The guards fell back instinctively, and she and the King were proceeding to their usual seats under the canopy without any protest from the President, who was engaged at the time in deciphering the contents of a packet which had just been brought to him. Before they had reached the steps of the dais, he looked up and ordered them to halt in so peremptory a tone that even Queen Selina obeyed involuntarily. "What's up now?" inquired Clarence in an undertone. "This packet directed to myself," said the President, "was found on the body of the late Marshal. It contains an order under the Royal seal and signature, which I will now read to the Council." And he read the Queen's secret order to the Baron to convey Daphne to England, which provoked general horror and execration. The Queen was thunderstruck as she heard this fresh proof of the Marshal's duplicity. She felt more than ever that she had been a fool to trust him. She might have known that he would take some dishonourable advantage of her confidence. "What have you to answer to this?" the President was saying to her, and she could see that both her husband and son were waiting anxiously for her reply. "Is it necessary for me to deny that I ever gave such an order?" she said, with a virtuous indignation that was really very well done. "Of course it was forged by that wicked Marshal." So fortunate, she thought, that he was dead. It is easy to see with what motive. Clarence and his father breathed again. For a few dreadful minutes they had been haunted by an ugly fear lest... But they ought to have felt assured that no member of the Wibberley Stimpson family could be so unworthy of the name. "It is possible," said the venerable President doubtfully, "that the handwriting may be but an imitation." "Nay," struck in the sturdy Burgomaster, "it is hers, sure enough. There can be no doubt to my mind that both our unlawful sovereigns and their son have plotted to deport our true Queen, the Lady Daphne, and that their vile design has succeeded but too well." "You're quite out of it, old cock!" shouted Clarence, through the roar of assent that greeted the Burgomaster's speech. "Why should we plot against her, when we hadn't an idea that she had a right to the throne?" "So you allege," said the Burgomaster, "but this order speaks for itself, and if the Council will take my advice, it will order all 3 of the prisoners to be executed at once in the city square, in sight of the people they have wronged and deceived." This suggestion evidently commended itself to the majority, but the President demurred. "We must not act too hastily," he said, "lest we find too late that we have been misled by appearances. It may be that Queen Daphne has reached Clairdelune in safety, but of that we cannot have sure knowledge until our messengers return. In the meantime, our prisoners must not be regarded as though they were proved guilty. I shall order that they be removed to apartments in the North Tower, where they are to be given honourable treatment, and every indulgence save their liberty. Should it be found that they are innocent, due reparation shall be made them." "And what if we hear that our Queen is not at Clairdelune?" asked the Burgomaster. "Then they shall receive no mercy," replied the President. "Their head shall be struck off that same day, in the great square of the capital." "Good," said the Burgomaster. "I will have the scaffold put up the moment I return." "I just want to say this, gentlemen," said Clarence before he was led away. "If we were really guilty of trying to get rid of poor little Lady Daphne, we should be such a set of rotters that we should jolly well deserve losing our heads for it. But you'll find we're not." "I can answer for my poor wife as for myself," said King Sidney. "She is far too much of a lady to dream of doing anything that isn't strictly correct." Queen Selina said nothing. She was not feeling well enough just then. "Not half bad," remarked Clarence, as he went through the suites of rooms that were to form their prison. "Pleasant look out from all the windows, and the room's jolly comfortable, considering. We shall do very well here for a day or two." "Don't talk in that light way, Clarence," said his mother, "or you'll drive me mad." "Why, there's nothing to be down in the mouth about, Mater. We may have to stick this longer, of course. Depends how long those chaps take getting back from Clairdelune. But as soon as they do get back, we shall be let out, and I shouldn't wonder if the country gave us a thundering good pension. It's no more than it ought to." You mustn't count on that. We must all of us prepare for the worst. The very worst." "What's skittles, Mater? What can they do to us? Unless, of course, Daphne wasn't sent to Clairdelune. But I saw her in the car myself." It doesn't follow that she got there, Clarence." "Why on earth shouldn't she?" "The Baron might have missed the way somehow." "Not he. He may be an old foozle, but the storks know their job anyhow." "We mustn't make too sure of anything," said his mother, who had the best reasons for knowing that Miss Heritage would never be found either in Clairdelune or Maerchenland, and that a shameful and probably exceedingly painful death on the scaffold was their inevitable fate. It was terrible to think that she, the acknowledged head and mastermind of the family, had brought them to such an end as this. More terrible still to see both her son and husband so utterly unprepared for it. Her nerves were jarred and fretted by King Sidney's apathy and Clarence's light-hearted optimism, and the impossibility of arousing them to a proper sense of their position. She could only do that by confessing what she had done, and she shuddered at the mere thought. If it would save them! But nothing would do that now. No, she could not lower herself so immeasurably in their esteem. She would carry her secret with her to the block itself. "Now, Mater," said Clarence, "you mustn't give way to the blues like this. You can take it from me that we're as right as rain. So cheer up, and let's see you smiling again." The unhappy Queen made a heroic attempt at a smile, but the result was so extraordinarily ghastly that it disheartened even Clarence. "Oh, very well, Mater," he said. "You needn't, if it hurts you as much as all that. But you've been so plucky up to now, I never thought you'd come out as a wet blanket." Even Marie Antoinette herself, thought Queen Selina bitterly, had never had to bear being called a wet blanket. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 21. Whose lights are fled, whose garlands dead. Daphne had taken her seat in the car with somewhat conflicting feelings. She was going to Clairdelune, where she would be reunited to Giroflée, an altogether joyous prospect, if she could hope to find the Giroflée with whom she had last parted. But he was now the magnificent young Prince Mirliflor, and it was quite uncertain whether she would even be able to recognize him. It would be dreadful if she discovered that she did not care for him any longer. Perhaps it was anxiety, but still more probably the fact of her fairy blood that prevented her from being overcome by the somnolence that none of purely British birth seemed able to resist for long after entering that magic car. Daphne was not in the least drowsy, and thus was startled, after the palace and XVIII had vanished out of sight, by hearing the Baron suddenly order the storks to go to the chapel in the forest of Schlangenzweigen, and seeing them wheel in a direction she knew was not that of their original destination. "What are you doing, Baron?" she cried. "I thought you were to take me straight to Clairdelune." The Baron put his hand to his heart, which he had once more been obliged to compress by a metal hoop, before he could speak. "It is now time," he began, "that you should be told who you are, madam, and the glorious future that awaits you." And, with a prolixity that may here be avoided, he informed her of her right to the crown of Maerchenland, and of the Marshal's arrangements for placing her on the throne. "But I don't want to be placed on the throne," said Daphne. "Do you really think I should turn out these poor Wibbly Stimpsons now, when they behaved so decently in letting me go? It would be too horribly mean of me if I did." At this he thought it his duty to enlighten her upon Queen Selina's perfidy, which naturally altered Daphne's opinion, but did not shake her determination. "If she is so keen about her crown, she may keep it," she said. "All I care for now is to get to Clairdelune and see Giroflé, I mean Mirliflor." "But," objected the Baron, employing the Marshal's argument, "we should arrive there days before the Prince." "Then," said Daphne imperiously, "tell the storks to take us to him, wherever he is." "If I did so," he objected, "the Marshal's plan would fall through." "And what if it does? How do you know that he's to be trusted? I always thought myself he had a bad face, and I don't feel at all inclined to put myself in his power. So you'll please not be a pig, Baron, but do as I say." No doubt her diction should have been more on a level with her dignity, but then it must be remembered that she had not been brought up as a prospective Fairy Queen. "I am convinced," he persisted, "that the Marshal's devotion to your Majesty's cause is beyond suspicion." "And I'm quite sure that it isn't," retorted Daphne. "If, as you tell me, Baron, I am your Queen, it's your duty to obey my orders, and I order you to take me to Mirliflor." He did not venture to oppose her any longer, so he gave the necessary command, and the great birds wheeled round once more towards Clairdelune. Mirliflor had discovered, after accomplishing a third of his journey, that his horse had suddenly gone so lame that it was unable to proceed at any pace but a walk. He had dismounted, and was leading it until he could reach a hostelry and provide himself with a fresh steed, when he heard a loud throbbing in the air behind him. The next moment a large flight of storks passed over his head and descended with a car on a spot some yards in advance of him. He saw at once that one of the occupants was Daphne, and leaving his horse by the wayside, he went forward to meet her, not without some constraint and uncertainty, however, for his fear that she would love him no longer had not ceased to haunt him. She had alighted and was standing still, her face expressing wonder and something of alarm. Could this splendid, gallant cavalier really be her homely Giroflé, she was thinking, and if he were, how could he help her to overcome this paralysing sense of his being a stranger? He came towards her, feeling almost as shy as she. "Daphne, my dearest," he said, stretching out his arms, "am I so changed that you can't care for me any more?" And, as she heard his voice, all her doubts and apprehensions suddenly fled. "No," she murmured, placing a fair hand on each of his broad shoulders and looking fearlessly up into his face. "You are just the same, really, my very own Giroflé. And oh, I'm so glad!" "And you forgive me for deceiving you, dearest?" he asked, when the first rapture of meeting and reassurance was over. "I was bound in honour to tell you nothing." "I know," she said. "The Court Godmother is to blame for that, not you. And I was prepared to find you changed, Mirliflor, only not quite so changed as this." "If you would love me better as I was, darling," he said, "tell me so, and I will make her transform me again. I will become Giroflée for the rest of my life, rather than lose you." "I don't think she is well enough to be asked to do that now," replied Daphne. "And besides," and here she held him from her at arm's length, "besides, now I look at you, you really are rather nice, you know. No, darling, I won't have you altered again." After all, this was only in accordance with Maerchenland's precedents. Did Beauty, for instance, resent her beast's emergence into a prince? All the same, Daphne was a little ashamed of herself for the increasing satisfaction she felt in Mirliflor's good looks. It seemed almost an infidelity to Giroflée. But she could not help it, and did not even try. The Baron had tactfully remained with the storks until, in his opinion, it was time to interrupt the lovers, when he stepped towards them, cracking loudly. "Sire," he said, "accept my congratulations on a good fortune that is perchance even greater than you yet know. You have won a lady who is not only lovely, but, as I shall show you, no other than the daughter of our late Prince Chrysopras, and thus rightfully entitled to the crown of Maerchenland." "And you knew this, Daphne?" cried Mirliflor, when the Baron had concluded. "Why did you say nothing to me about it?" "I only heard of it myself just now in the car," she said. "And what does it matter? I don't want to claim the crown. All I want is to live at Clairdelune with you." But he told her it was her duty to her country to assert her just rights, and, on being informed of the appointment with the Marshal, he was in favour of keeping it. "He will be useful," he said, "if he's an honest supporter of your cause." "But I'm quite certain he isn't," said Daphne. "We can only make sure by meeting him," he replied, "and as of course I shall be with you, you will be in no danger." He had no weapon but the sword that had served him so well at Drachenstolz, which he had brought away with him rather as a souvenir than with any idea that he might need it on his journey, but Daphne felt that, so long as Mirliflor was at her side, she had nothing to fear, and so she readily consented to re-enter the car and be taken to the chapel in the forest, where the Marshal in all probability was awaiting her arrival. As the car neared the borders of the forest, Mirliflor took out the silk cap which the Baron had lent him. "I meant to have returned this to you, Baron," he said, "but I find I have it still. With your permission I will keep it a little longer, as I fancy it may be useful. Don't be alarmed, darling," he added to Daphne, "if you don't see me when I put this on. Remember that, though I shall be invisible, I shall be near you all the time." "I'll try to remember, Mirliflor," said Daphne. But don't stay invisible longer than you can possibly help." The chapel stood in a clearing in the very middle of the forest, and the storks calculated their descent with such nicety that they brought the car up in front of the door. The Marshal, in his plumed helmet, golden cuirass, and high boots of gilded leather, was waiting, and now came forward to help Daphne to alight. His visor was raised, but the company of knights with him wore theirs down, so that it was impossible for her to know who they were, or whether they intended her good or ill. "We expected you long ere this, Lady Daphne," said the Marshal as he handed her out. "Did you, Marshal?" she said, trying to appear unconcerned. "We went a little out of our way." She noted that, either by accident or design, several of the knights had interposed themselves between herself and the Baron. "We have the less time at our disposal," said the Marshal, "so I will come to the point at once. You have no doubt been already informed of your rights, and that I and my companions are here to place you on the throne, provided you accept my conditions." I was not told of any conditions," said Daphne. "There is but one," he said, and at this the chapel door was thrown open, and a priest of extremely disreputable exterior appeared on the threshold, with the lighted altar as his background. "Wed me, and you shall be Queen of Maerchenland." "I've no wish to be that," she replied, "and, as you know, Marshal, I've already promised to marry Prince Mirliflor." "You may dismiss all thought of that," he said blandly, "for if you refuse my hand, both you and the Baron will meet with instant death. The car and birds will also be destroyed and buried, and I have so arranged that it will be believed that Her Majesty Queen Selina has had you removed to the distant land from which you came." "Marshal," pleaded Daphne, trying hard to remember that Mirliflor was really by her side, I must have time to think over your proposal." "It may help you to decide, Lady Daphne," he said, "if you reflect that, in any case, you will never again behold Prince Mirliflor of Clairdelune." "And why not, Marshal?" said Mirliflor, as he flung away the cap of darkness and stepped in front of his beloved. The Marshal knew at once that his fate was sealed. He stood no chance whatever against a prince who had slain a dragon single-handed. The knights also seemed to recognize this, or else their sympathy had veered to Daphne's side, for they stood back in a circle without attempting to interfere, while the priest, who perhaps had not till then understood that the marriage ceremony was to be compulsory, promptly re-entered the little chapel and blew out all the candles. The combat was over in a second or two, as any combat would necessarily be in which one of the antagonists was equipped with an irresistible sword. Mirliflor, to be sure, did not know that he possessed this somewhat unsportsmanlike advantage, and had disdained to shelter himself as he might have done under the cap. But it is more than possible that if he had known more about the sword, he would have stretched the point of honour in this particular case. As has already been seen, he had occasional lapses from the ideals the Fairy had bestowed on him at his baptism, and he was quite incapable of troubling himself about them when Daphne's life was at stake. Perhaps he ought to have been more consistently punctilious, but he was not, which was fortunate for both of them. As soon as the knights saw the Marshal fall, they hastened to protest their loyalty to their young Queen and offer their congratulations, which Daphne thought it politic to accept at their face value. Horses were found for her and Mirliflor, who decided to make, with the picked body of the knights, for a village a league from Eswaranmal and await developments there. Of the rest of the party, some were instructed to go back to the palace and report the Marshal's death while hunting, the rest remained to bury his body, and it was one of these who found the packet, and, most unluckily for Queen Selina, thought it necessary to deliver it in hot haste to its addressee. The Baron was directed to go on in the car to Clairdelune and inform King Tournesol that his son had found a bride at last. On reaching the village near Eswaranmal, Mirliflor had sent on two of his escort into the city to ascertain the state of feeling there. They brought back the unexpected news that all the citizens now knew that the Lady Daphne was entitled to the crown and were demanding her. That Queen Selina with her husband and son had been imprisoned on suspicion of having made away with her, and, if she were not forthcoming by an early date, would be executed publicly without fail. In the heat of his resentment at the treachery which had so nearly succeeded in parting him from Daphne for ever, Mirliflor declared that they should be left to the doom which they would certainly meet if Daphne's return were kept secret for a few days. Mirliflor said that, not Giroflé, she told him. Giroflé would never be so horribly cold-blooded. But even Mirliflor didn't really mean it. Of course we can't let these Stimson people be executed. Besides, I know, I can't say how, but I do know, that Mr. Stimson and Clarence at any rate haven't been parties to any plot to get rid of me. And as for Mrs. Stimson, I dislike her, and I want to go on disliking her, which I couldn't possibly do after she had her head cut off. So we'll go into Eswaranmal at once, Mirliflor, and do what we can for the poor things." "I spoke in haste, dearest," said Mirliflor. "I was wrong, and you are right, as usual." "And now we're both going to be right, darling," said Daphne. "I wish," Clarence remarked later the same day, "I wish these windows looked out on the front. We might see her coming back in that blessed stork car. She'll be sure to come the quickest way when she hears we're in the soup like this. Don't you think so, Mater?" "I'm sure I don't know," said the tortured Queen Selina. "She mayn't come back at all. I mean, she may keep the messengers and leave us to perish. It is only what I should expect of her." "No, dash it all, Mater, she's too much of a sport for that," he said. "She'll either turn up or send word that she's all right." "Don't deceive yourself, Clarence," said his mother. "I know better than you can, and I tell you that she will do neither." "Not when it's to save our lives?" he replied. "She's bound to, unless anything has happened to her. I'm a bit worried about that, because, well, time's getting on, you know, what?" "I trust, my boy," said his father, "we shall not be brought to the scaffold by any mistake of that kind. If that occurred, it would be most He caught his wife's eye and substituted unsatisfactory. "I'm not sure," he added, "but I fancy I hear shouting. Seems to come from below." "It certainly is shouting," said Clarence, "and it's getting louder. They're coming this way. I hope I'm wrong, but I've a strong impression that we're going to get it in the neck after all." "Sidney! Clarence!" cried Queen Selina as she sank on her knees, unable to bear her guilty burden any longer. I can't die without asking you to forgive me for what I've brought on you." "It's no fault of yours, Mater," said Clarence. "Just the family luck, that's all." "Ah, but listen, listen!" implored his mother. But before she could proceed, the door was suddenly unlocked, and Prince Tapfer von Schneiderleinheimer entered with every sign of respect. "I am charged by Her Majesty Queen Daphne to desire your attendance in the throne room," he said, "and to convey her and Prince Mirliflor's regret that you should have been subjected to any inconvenience by having permitted her departure to Clair de Lune." Queen Selina, or rather Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, as she was now once more, hastily rose from her knees. So the Baron had disobeyed his orders, and Miss Heritage did not even know that they had been given. This was indeed an unhoped for deliverance. What a mercy, she thought, that it had come just before she had spoken words she could never have recalled. "Kindly assure your mistress," she said, with all the dignity of fallen grandeur, "that while we cannot but feel that we have been most unjustly suspected, we are willing to make every allowance for the circumstances, and shall have much pleasure in coming down to offer our congratulations presently. But first I want to see the Princess Royal and Princess Ruby, if they are well enough to leave their dungeons." "Your daughters, madam, have merely been required to remain in their own apartments, and are in perfect health," he replied. "I will have them conducted to you immediately." "Oh, Mummy!" exclaimed Ruby a little later, as she ran to her mother's arms. "Is it really true? Aren't you and Daddy King and Queen any more?" "No, my darling," said Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson. "It seems the people would rather have Miss Heritage." "Oh, I don't mind so much if it's Daphne. And will Prince Mirliflor be king?" "I really can't say how they will arrange it, nor does it interest me what they may do." "It does me," said Ruby. "I hope they'll let us stay here with them." "I consider it most unlikely, even if I were willing to be a guest in my own palace. But I've no doubt they will make some suitable provision for us." "Speaking for myself, Mother," said Edna, "I should be far happier leading a simple life in retirement than ever I've been in this pretentious place. And, though I never cared much about being a princess, we can scarcely be treated as commoners after what we have been." "I shall settle all these matters myself with Miss Queen Daphne, I suppose I ought to call her now, but it's so difficult to get into just at once. And now I think we will all go down to the throne room. Remember on no account to show the slightest ill feeling. Let her see that, if we have lost everything else, we still retain our manners." She was herself so far from betraying any ill feeling when she entered the throne room that she was almost overwhelmingly affectionate. "My dear child," she said, advancing to Daphne, who was standing in the centre of the room with Mirliflor, "so pleased to see you both back. But we're all of us that. And, as I was saying to my husband only a few minutes ago, I'm sure, Sidney," I said, "there's no person in the world I would give up my crown to so willingly as I would to dear Miss Heritage." "Most happy," said her husband. "We've abdicated already, your Majesty, both of us, as soon as we knew the facts." I'm most awfully glad to see your Majesty back again," said Clarence, noting the flush on her cheeks and the sparkle in her eyes as she glanced at Mirliflor, whom he envied more than ever. "I was beginning to think shouldn't you ran things a trifle close." "Perhaps I did," said Daphne. "But you see, I thought it was wiser to try to find Mirliflor before being taken to Clair de Lune." She said this quite simply, for she could see that, as she had been sure of from the first, both Clarence and his father were no parties to Mrs. Stimpson's design, and she was anxious to spare them all knowledge of it if she could. Her words only confirmed Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson's sense of security. Daphne evidently suspected nothing, probably because the false Marshal had never handed the Baron his secret instructions. "Much the best plan, I'm sure, your Majesty," she agreed, "though it was fortunate for us that you found dear Prince Mirliflor so soon. However, it has all ended happily, so we will say no more about it. And now I want to beg that you mustn't consider us. If you would like to have possession of the Palace at once, you have only to say so. Or if I could be of any use to you by staying on for a little, just to show you how things ought to be done." Daphne forced herself to be civil to her for her family's sake, not her own. "It's very good of you," she said, "but I'm afraid it won't be possible for you to stay here." "Well," said Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, "we shall be perfectly satisfied with any residence, if it's only quite a moderate-sized castle, that your Majesty is good enough to put at our disposal, not too far from here, or poor Ruby," here she glanced at her younger daughter, who had taken possession of one of Daphne's hands, which she was kissing and fondling, "would be quite inconsolable at losing her dearest friend." But her remarks were lost on Daphne, for just then, to Mrs. Stimpson's surprise and secret dismay, the entrance was formally announced of the Court Godmother, whom she had imagined to be at least moribund, if not dead. She came in, looking frail and feeble, but still with much of the energy and vitality that had seemed to have departed for ever. "Really," thought the disgusted Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, "Mother Hubbard's dog is a fool to her." Daphne had already gone to greet her and lead her to a seat. "I'm much better, my child. In fact, almost as well as ever. A day or two ago I thought I was dying, but a little rest and the good news of your return have quite set me up again. I begin to think I shall see my second century out yet." "It is indeed a marvellous recovery, my dear Court Godmother," chimed in Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson. "We've all been so anxious. We should have sent to inquire, only we couldn't, because well, you'll hardly believe it, but we've been imprisoned, and very nearly executed too, on a ridiculous charge of having made away with our dear young Queen here, when, as you know, I had actually gone out of my way to have her sent to Clairdelune as soon as I found you were too ill to see to it yourself." "And well for you that you did so," said the grim old Fairy, "for if you had played, or even sought to play, her false, I would have seen to it, old and ailing as I am, that such treason did not go unpunished." Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson shivered inwardly under the implacable old eyes. She knew well that she could expect no mercy if the Fairy discovered that these secret orders had ever been handed to the Baron. Only, as the Baron had never received them, he could tell her nothing, and as the Council now believed them to be a forgery of the Marshal's, Mrs. Stimpson felt herself fairly safe. "Yes, dear Court Godmother," she said sweetly, "but you see, I haven't, so we needn't discuss that now, need we? When you came in just now, I was just telling Her Majesty that we had no desire to stay on at the Palace longer than is unavoidable, but that, naturally, we were anxious to know where accommodation would be found for us. Nothing grand, of course. Any fairly large chateau would suit us." "I'm sorry," said Daphne, after stooping to kiss Ruby, "but that is quite impossible." "Impossible!" cried Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson. "I can't believe that your Majesty would turn us out of our own Palace, without a home to go to." "You have Inglegarth," said Daphne, "and as soon as the Baron returns with the car, he shall take you there." "I'm much obliged to your Majesty," returned Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, her complexion deepening to a rich purple. "Very much obliged for such truly generous treatment. Some people might think that, considering that you wouldn't be Queen at all but for our kindness in taking you with us when we were brought here, by no seeking of ours, to reign over this ridiculous country, I say, some people might call this rather shabby and ungrateful, especially when we gave way the moment we were told there had been a mistake, sooner than make any fuss or trouble, as few sovereigns in our position would have done. And now it seems we're to be rewarded by being bundled back to a suburban residence which, whatever else may be said for it, is absurdly inadequate for any retired royalties. But you'll find we're not to be got rid of quite so easily. I absolutely decline to go back to Gablehurst to be an ordinary nobody after what I have been. Nothing in the world shall induce me to." "My love," said her husband, "we can't stay here if we're not wanted." "No, Mater," said Clarence, "we've got to clear." "I shall be thankful to get away myself," added Edna. "What is Maerchenland, after all? Just a petty little kingdom that nobody even knows is in existence." "You may go if you please," Mrs. Stimpson declared. "I shall stay. If I have to sit and starve to death at the Palace gates, and a pretty scandal that will be!" "If you are allowed to starve," said the Fairy Vogelflug, "which you wouldn't be, you'd get food enough, but no sympathy. So I should advise you myself to return to your own country, where you are probably held in more esteem than you are here. And now," she added to Daphne, "I must ask your Majesty's leave to withdraw to my own apartments. I shall be obliged if you would send the Baron to me as soon as he arrives from Clairdelune." And with this, and a stiff but stately curtsy to the young Queen, she hobbled out of the throne room. "I shall maintain to my dying breath," declared Mrs. Stimpson vehemently, "that, after governing this country as we have done, we have earned the right to stay in it. I consider we are not only entitled to that, but to a suitable establishment and pension. Your Majesty can surely spare us something out of all we have given up." Daphne intimated that she wished to reply to Mrs. Stimpson in private, whereupon the others withdrew out of hearing and left them together. "I hate having to say it," she began in a low voice, "but you really can't stay here on any terms, Mrs. Stimpson. I think I needn't tell you why." "Your Majesty surely doesn't suspect me of any—" "I don't suspect," said Daphne. "I know how you tried to part me from Prince Mirliflor for ever, and how nearly you succeeded. He knows too. Oh, you are in no danger from us. We shall say nothing. But there's someone else who might." "Not the Baron!" cried Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, so thrown off her guard that she failed to see how completely the question gave her away. "Yes," said Daphne, gravely, "the Baron. You heard what the Court Godmother said about seeing him as soon as he returns. We have forbidden him to speak, but it's quite possible that she will get the truth out of him, and that might be rather disagreeable for you, mightn't it?" "Very," agreed the trembling Mrs. Stimpson. "She'd have no mercy on me, on any of us." "I'm afraid not," said Daphne, "and she might not listen even to me. So don't you think it would be wiser to change your mind about staying and go back to Gablehurst before she does see him?" "Much," said Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson in a half choked voice. "Much, if it can be arranged." "I think it can. The journey to Clairdelune and back won't tire the storks. They will be quite able to take you over to England as soon as you're ready to start." "We'll go and get ready at once," said Mrs. Stimpson, "so as not to keep the car waiting. You have plenty of time. It can't be here for some hours yet. Oh, I hope the Baron will make haste, and if your Majesty could only prevent him from seeing the Court Godmother till after we're gone." "She'll probably be asleep," said Daphne, "but in any case he shall have instructions to take you home the very moment he arrives at the Palace. I think," she added, "that is all we had to say to one another." "Except," said Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, "that your Majesty really must allow me to express my deep sense of the very handsome—" "No, please," said Daphne, turning away, for she felt that she had had as much of Mrs. Stimpson as she could stand just then. That good lady, having partially recovered her equanimity, retreated to her husband and family. "I've been talking it over with Her Majesty, Sidney," she announced, "and she has quite brought me to see that, under the circumstances, we shall really be more comfortable in dear old England. So she has kindly arranged for us to be taken home in the car directly it gets back from Clairdelune." "Glad to hear it, my love," said the ex-monarch. "Personally, I much prefer Inglegarth to this sort of thing." "But I say," Clarence put in, glancing down at his fantastic attire, "I don't quite see myself going back to Gablehurst in this get-up. Wish I knew what had become of the kit we came in." It was now the hour when the Court was accustomed to go up and change their costumes before dinner, and Daphne felt a difficulty as to the proper course to pursue with the Wibberley Stimpsons. Could she without indelicacy invite them to sit as guests at what had lately been their own table? And yet it seemed hardly human to leave them out. She decided that the former course was on the whole less open to objection. "I hope," she said to Mrs. Stimpson with a touch of shyness, "that you will all give me the pleasure of dining with us this evening. You see, you must have something to eat before such a long journey." "Your Majesty is most kind," said Mrs. Stimpson in a great flurry, "but if you will excuse us from accepting what, no one knows better than I, is really a command, I really don't think we should have time to sit through a long dinner. We might miss the car, and besides, there's the question of dressing. If we could have a few sandwiches and a little wine in one of the vestibules while we are waiting for the car, that will be all we shall require." "You shall do exactly as you please about it," replied Daphne. She was greatly relieved, as one reason for her hesitation in asking them had been the dread that Mr. Stimpson might think himself called upon to make an after-dinner speech. Her ladies-in-waiting were already in her tiring chamber, highly delighted by the prospect of arraying a Queen whom, even when she had been nominally one of themselves, they had always not merely admired but adored. It had suddenly occurred to Daphne that the Stimpson family might find themselves on their return to Gablehurst in certain difficulties against which she felt bound to do what she could to protect them. She thought over the best means of doing this, which took so much time to carry out that the business of arraying her for her first banquet as a royal hostess had to be got through more hurriedly than her ladies of the bedchamber thought at all decorous. But she knew that Mirliflor would be well content with her, however she looked, and as a matter of fact he not only was, but had every reason to be so. The Wibberley Stimpsons had already ascertained that the clothes they had worn on their arrival in Maerchenland had been carefully laid up in one of the royal wardrobes, from which they were brought at their earnest request. They put them on in frantic haste, and, in deadly fear of being surprised by the royal household, they stole down the great staircase to an antechamber by the entrance hall. There they found a table set with every description of tempting food, to which all did justice but Mrs. Stimpson, the state of whose nerves had entirely taken away her appetite. She was continually starting up and saying, "Listen, I'm sure I hear these storks." "You'd better eat something, Mater," Clarence said. "It's the last dinner we shall ever have in Maerchenland." "I can't," she replied. "I don't know how any of you can. There go the silver trumpets. She's going into the banqueting hall now. On Prince Mirliflor's arm, most likely. How she can have the heart when she must know we are still here." "She did ask us to dinner, my love," Mr. Stimpson mildly reminded her. "She had the execrable taste to do that, Sidney," replied his wife, "and I think the manner in which I declined must have been a lesson to her. Dear me, is that car never coming?" She said that many times during the evening, as they sat on in the ebony and ivory chamber, while the strains of music reached them faintly from the distant ballroom. Clarence thought gloomily of the dance on the night of the coronation, and how his mother had forbidden him to choose Daphne as his partner. Perhaps if he had insisted on having his own way, if he had not limited himself to a merely morganatic alliance, she might have... But it was too late to grouse about that now. He endeavoured to cheer himself by the thought that he would very soon be in a civilized land of cigarettes. It was getting late, and the music had now ceased, from which they gathered that the Queen and Court had already retired. "She might have had the common civility to say good-bye to us," complained Mrs. Stimpson. "But of course she is too grand now to condescend so far. Not that I have any desire to see her again, on the contrary." The doors of the vestibule were thrown open here, and one of the ushers announced, "Her Majesty the Queen and His Royal Highness Prince Mirliflor." "Coming here to triumph over us!" was Mrs. Stimpson's comment as she rose. "We came to wish you a pleasant journey to Gablehurst," explained Daphne as she entered, followed by Mirliflor. "I hope you won't have to wait for the car much longer, but I've told the attendants in the hall to let you know the minute it is here." She was looking radiantly lovely and girlish, and queenly as well, in spite of the fact that she was still uncrowned. But if she had had the right to wear her crown, she was incapable of doing so just then. Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson made a curtsy that might have been lower if she had had any practice, but all the curtsying previously had been done to herself. "We thank your Majesty," she said. "I too hope there will be no more of this delay. I'm getting worn out with all this waiting. Oh, while I think of it," she went on, the desire to be offensive overcoming any fear of the consequences, "of course we are not in a position now to give really valuable wedding presents, and I am afraid mine must be a very humble offering, particularly as it needs repairing. However, such as it is, perhaps your Majesty will honour me by accepting it with our congratulations and very best wishes." And she offered the jewel which she had formerly acquired from Daphne. Daphne's eyebrows contracted for an instant, but the next moment she laughed. "I really couldn't, Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson," she said. "You see, you have already given it to Clarence, and I mustn't deprive him of it." "Won't you accept it from me, then?" he said awkwardly. I shan't have any use for it now." She shook her head. "You'll please me so much better by keeping it," she said gently, "in memory of Maerchenland." It was true that it had once belonged to her father, the father she had never known, but then it had also belonged to Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, and Daphne was conscious now of an invincible unwillingness to accept any gift from that lady. I'd do anything to please you," said Clarence, taking the pendant from his mother and slipping it into the pocket of his dinner jacket. Ruby, in the white silk frock she had last worn at Inglegarth, was clinging to Daphne. "I don't want to go back," she wailed. "I want to stay here with you. Won't you send for me some day? Say you will. Do say you will." Daphne stooped to caress and comfort her, and also to hide her own emotion. "I wish I could, darling," she said tenderly. "But I'm afraid I mustn't make any promises that I'm not sure of being able to keep." "Then say you will, perhaps," entreated Ruby, but her mother promptly interposed. "Ruby, my dear," she said, "you're forgetting how far Her Majesty is now our superior. A palace is no longer a fit place for any of us to visit, and I consider it best we should remain in future strictly in our respective spheres." "Then I will go to mine at once," said Daphne, smiling. "Goodbye, Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson. Goodbye, Edna." She held out her hand to both of them, but they curtsied formally without offering to take it. "Goodbye, dearest little Ruby. I hope your next governess will love you nearly as much as I do. She can't quite. Goodbye, Mr. Stimpson. I think you will be rather glad to be back in the city again, won't you?" "I shall indeed, your Majesty," he said. "To tell you the honest truth, I don't think I was ever cut out for a monarch." It was Clarence's turn next, and when he saw her offering him her hand with the old frank friendliness, he had a renewed sense of his own unworthiness. "No," he said in a low voice, "you can't want to shake hands with such a hopeless rotter as I've been." "I shouldn't," she replied, "if I weren't sure that you could be something very much better if you chose. And I know you will choose." "I will," he said. "I swear I will, if I ever get the chance." "Your chance will come, quite soon perhaps, and when it does, remember that I believe in you. And goodbye, Clarence." "Goodbye, Daphne," he said brokenly. As he took her hand he thought with a keen pang that he had never held it before, and never would again. And the time had been, or so at least he imagined, when he might have made that hand his own for ever. "Good night, Mirliflor," said Daphne, as he held aside the hangings for her. "We shall meet tomorrow." She passed into the great hall with a dignity the more charming for being so natural and unconscious, and that was the last Clarence was ever destined to see of her. He turned to Mirliflor, whose eyes still betrayed the pride he felt in his beloved. "I don't mind telling you, old chap, Prince Mirliflor, that I took to you from the start, and, as I can't be the lucky man myself, I'm jolly glad it's to be you." "Thank you," said Mirliflor, who was less given to florid phrases than the average Fairy Prince. "So am I." "I dare say," Clarence went on, as he realised the contrast between his own clothes and the magnificent costume that the old Fairy had provided for her royal godson, "I dare say you're thinking we're not looking very smart." Mirliflor was honestly able to disclaim having any impressions on the subject. "Well, these togs must seem a bit rummy to you, but I can assure you that, for informal occasions like the present, they're quite the right thing in England." He had a momentary impulse to accept his father's white tie, but, after all, why should he say anything about that when Mirliflor knew no better? So he decided to pass it. "Worn by the very best society." Mirliflor politely accepted this information and then made his farewells. Edna's good wishes were couched in a spirit of frigid magnanimity. She had too much self-respect to let him perceive that she resented his fickleness. They were now alone in the antechamber. From time to time Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson would rise impatiently and peer out into the vast hall, now only lit by one or two flickering cressets, to see if the stork car had arrived, but the attendants in waiting always assured her that it had not. And, after some fussing and fretting, she lay down on a divan and fell into an uneasy slumber. Her husband was snoring placidly. Ruby had cried herself to sleep long before. Edna had brought down her lecture notes and was conscientiously employing the time in polishing up her knowledge of English literature. Her notes on Nietzsche's philosophy had been torn out after the rupture with the Count. Somehow, the Nietzschean theories did not seem to work quite well when carried into practice. But after deciphering a very few literature notes, Edna found herself too drowsy to continue. Clarence remained awake longest. He had wandered restlessly out into the hall just to look at the great staircase half lost in the gloom. Daphne had ascended it a little while since. Tomorrow she would come down, fresh and radiant, to meet Mirliflor. Before long they would be married and crowned, and live happy ever after in the good old Maerchenland way. Well, he wouldn't have to look on and see them doing it, which was some consolation. He went back to the antechamber and regarded the sleeping forms of his family with disillusioned eyes. "We look like royalties, I don't think," he said to himself. "No wonder they've booted us out. Why, a bully rabbit warren would." But this depressing reflection soon ceased to trouble him, unless it still continued to shadow his dreams. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 22. Squaring Accounts. Almost simultaneously, Mr. Wibberley Stimpson and his son and daughters opened their eyes, then rubbed them and sat up and looked about them with a bewilderment that gradually gave way to intense relief. For, although the light had faded, their surroundings were reassuringly familiar. They were in their own drawing-room at Inglegarth. It occurred at once to most of them that they had never actually left it, an impression that was pleasantly confirmed by Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson's first remark as she awoke later. "Why, hasn't the dinner gone yet?" she inquired crossly. "Cook gets more and more unpunctual." "I don't think it can be 8 o'clock yet, my dear," said her husband. "It's quite light still." "Nonsense, Sidney, it must be long past dinner time. I've been so lost in my own thoughts that somehow I—" "Now, Mother, you know you've been asleep and only just woke up," said Edna, from one of the chintz couches. "Have I? Perhaps I did drop off just for a few seconds. In fact, I must have done, for I began to recollect having quite a curious dream. I dreamt that you and I, Sidney, were King and Queen of some absurd fairy kingdom or other, and that—well, it was not at all a pleasant dream." "It's a most singular coincidence, Selina," he said, "but I've been dreaming much the same sort of thing myself." The others looked at one another, but none of them ventured to express just yet what was in all their minds. "Have you?" said his wife languidly. "I suppose it was telepathy or something of that kind. Ring for Mitchell, Clarence. I hope dinner has not been allowed to get cold. And Miss Heritage seems to have left the drawing-room. Run up, Ruby, and tell her to come down." "I don't believe she's upstairs at all, Mummy," said Ruby. "No, of course she can't be. We left her in the Palace, don't you remember? She's Queen now, you know." "Queen? Miss Heritage? Why, you don't mean to tell me you've been dreaming that too?" "So have I, as far as that goes, Mater," said Clarence. "If it was a dream, and not... How could it be anything else? Besides, here we all are, exactly as we were." "We've got our cloaks and things on, though," said Ruby. "I know how it was. We've been brought here in the stork car while we were fast asleep. We sat up ever so long waiting for it." "It can't be. I won't believe anything so absurd. Draw the curtains, somebody, and pull up the blinds. It's odd, but it certainly looks more like early morning than any other time. Clarence, go out and strike the gong. Perhaps the maids haven't finished dressing yet." Clarence went out accordingly. The gong bellowed and boomed from the hall, but there was no sound of stirring above. "I say," he reported, "I've just looked into the dining room, and all the chairs are upside down on the table. That looks rather as if we'd been away for a bit, what?" "Clarence, you're not beginning to think that all that about our having been a royal family may be true?" "Well, Mater," he said, "if we haven't been in Maerchenland, where have we been?" "Oh yes, we've been royalties right enough, and a pretty rotten job we made of it." At this time there was a deprecatory knock at the drawing-room door. "Mitchell!" cried her mistress. "Don't you know better than to—" However, it was not Mitchell that entered, but a person unknown, a respectable-looking elderly female who seemed to have made a hasty toilette. "Asking you pardons," he said, "but if you're wishing to see the family, they're away just now." "We are the family," replied Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson. "We have been abroad, but have returned, and we should be glad of breakfast at once." "I can get you a cup of tea as soon as the kettle's on the boil," she said, "but I'm only put in as caretaker like. There's nothing in the house except bread and butter. The shops'll be opening now, so if you don't object to waiting a little, I could go out and get you an haddock and eggs and such like." "Yes, buck up, old lady," said Clarence. "And I say, see if you can get a Daily Mail or a paper of some sort." "What are you so anxious to see the paper for?" inquired Edna after the caretaker had departed. "Only wanted to know what month we're in," he said. "It would have looked so silly to ask her what day it is. We must have been, over there, a good long time." "At least a year," said Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson, no longer able to sustain the dream theory. "More. When we left it was quite early spring, and now all the trees are out. Sidney, what will your firm say to your having been away so long without letting them know where you were?" "I can't say, my love. I'm afraid they might make it a ground for a dissolution of partnership, unless I can give them a satisfactory explanation of my absence." "The difficulty will be to find one," said his wife. "As for you, Clarence, they will be too glad to see you back again at the insurance office to ask any questions." "I dare say they would, Mater, only it didn't seem worth mentioning before, but as a matter of fact I resigned the day we left." "Then it seems," said Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson bitterly, "we've been sent back here to find ourselves in comparative poverty. I hope and trust," she felt furtively in her bead handbag before continuing more cheerfully, "that we shall be able to struggle through somehow." She knew now that they would not be without resources. She could feel them through the handkerchief in which they had been wrapped, two pieces which she had had the presence of mind to pick up from the Halma board as she passed through Edna's and Ruby's chamber the evening before. One was carved from a ruby, the other from a diamond, and each of them was worth a small fortune. Her one regret now was that she had not pocketed several more while she was about it. But although she would have been perfectly within her rights in doing so, for were they not her own property, she had thought at the time that it would be risky to take any number that could be noticed. There was always the chance that Miss Heritage might count them. However, she said nothing about this to her family just then. It would be a pleasant surprise for them later on. "But," she continued, "I do think it might have occurred to Miss Heritage, I can't and won't call her by any other name, that, as she was known to be in my employment when we left Inglegarth, our returning without her may expose us to very unpleasant remarks. People may think I've discharged her, left her stranded in foreign parts, or I don't know what." "That is what she calculated on, no doubt," said Edna. "Oh, stop it, Edna," said her brother. "You ought to know her better than that." "Oh, of course she's an angel in your estimation, but she could have saved Mother from being misunderstood if she'd wanted to, and since she hasn't, well, I'll leave you to draw the obvious inference." Ruby, who had been roving about the room during this conversation, now broke in. "Mummy," she cried, "there's a letter here for you, and it looks like darling Queen Daphne's writing." And she brought it to her mother. It was enclosed in a folded square of parchment, envelopes, like other modern conveniences, being unknown in Maerchenland, and fastened with the royal signet, which Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson broke with a melancholy reminiscence of the satisfaction it had given her to use the seal herself. "Dear Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson," she read aloud, "as I am about to be married here very shortly, my return with you to England will naturally be impossible. It is a great grief to me to have to part from my dear little pupil Ruby, to whom I have become so deeply and sincerely attached. Will you please tell her from me that I shall never forget her, and miss her very much indeed. Believe me, very truly yours, Daphne Heritage. "Well," commented Mrs. Stimpson, while poor Ruby's tears began to flow afresh, "that is certainly a letter which I could show to anybody. Though I notice she doesn't say anything about being grieved to part with anyone but Ruby. A deliberate slight to the rest of us. And then the meanness of turning us out without the slightest return for all we've done for her. It does show such petty ingratitude." "Easy on, Mater," said Clarence. "She don't seem to have let us go away quite empty-handed after all. I mean to say, there's a box or something over there that I fancy I've seen before in the Palace." He went up to examine it as he spoke. It was an oblong case, rather deeper and squarer than a backgammon box, covered with faded orange velvet and fitted with clasps and corners of finely wrought silver set with precious stones. Inside were the emerald and opal halma board and ruby and diamond pieces, and with them a slip of parchment with Daphne's handwriting. "I thought perhaps," she had written, "you might care to have this. Princess Rapunzelhauser tells me she is afraid 2 of the men are missing, but I hope she is mistaken and they are really all there. D." "I shall never play with them," declared Ruby, breaking down once more. I couldn't bear to, without her." "Of course you will never play with them, my dear," said her mother. "They are far too valuable for that." A very inadequate impression of Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson's strength of character must have been given if anyone expects that this gift would cause her the slightest degree of shame or contrition. On the contrary, it only served to justify her in her own eyes, not that she needed any justification, of her having appropriated those 2 pieces. She had merely anticipated, and nothing would be easier than to put them back in the box without being observed. "A magnificent present," pronounced Mr. Stimpson. "Really what I should call very handsome indeed of her. If we ever had to sell this set, they'd fetch a colossal sum here. Simply colossal." "And a minute ago, Mater," said Clarence, "you accused her of being mean." "Well," she replied, "and what are these things, when all is said, to the riches we've surrendered to her? A mere trifle, which she'll never even miss." "You're forgetting they were hers, not ours, all the time. And we've left her precious little gold to go on with. It makes me sick to hear you running her down when... Well, anyhow, Mater, I'll be glad if you won't, in my hearing." "There's no occasion to use that tone to me, Clarence. I have my own opinion of Miss Heritage, and I'm not likely to alter it now. But if you choose to keep your illusions about her, I shall say nothing to disturb them." "You may be very clever, Clarence," said Edna. "I know you think you are, but there's one subject at all events you're hopelessly ignorant about, and that's women." "I don't mind owning it," he retorted. "I'd have taken my oath once that a highly superior cultivated English girl like you could never have cottoned to any Johnny in the ogre line of business, but you've shown me my mistake." Edna, who was scarlet with wrath, would no doubt have made an obvious rejoinder had not a diversion been caused by the caretaker, who appeared with that morning's Daily Mail. "Ah, so you managed to get a paper?" cried Clarence. "Good!" And he took it from her hands and opened it. "I say," he announced as soon as they were alone, "we haven't been away so long as we thought. We're still in 1914. Saturday, 25th of July." "Is that all?" said his mother. "But I remember now that tiresome old Court Godmother saying that time went quicker in Maerchenland than it does here. I don't understand how, but there's evidently some difference. The 25th of July? Dear me, the pageant must be over and done with long ago. Not of course that I should have cared to take part in it now." "Well, my boy," said Mr. Stimpson, as Clarence ran through the columns of the paper, "and what's the latest news?" "First defeat of Middlesex," replied Clarence. "Surrey's at the head of the table now for the championship. Fine batting by Gloucester at Nottingham yesterday. 319 to Nott's 299 first innings, and 75 for 3 wickets." "Capital," said his father, without enthusiasm. "And what about politics? Got Home Rule yet?" "I'll tell you in a minute. Looks as if they hadn't. Breakdown of Home Rule conference at Buckingham Palace. Wonder what the Government will do now." "They've only to be firm," said Mr. Stimpson, in his character as ex-autocrat, If Ulster chooses to resent the will of the people, as expressed in the last general election, well, she must be put down, or what's our army for, I should like to know. Any other news?" "Nothing much, except that Austria's just sent an ultimatum to Servia. Seems the Austrian Grand Duke's been assassinated, and Austria believes the Servians were in it. Anyhow, they've got to knuckle down by 6 o'clock tonight, or they'll be jolly well walloped. But of course they'll give in when they're up against Austria. I see these writing chaps are doing their best to work up a scare, though. Here's one of them actually saying it may plunge all Europe into war. Good old Armageddon coming off at last, I suppose. How they can write such tommy-rot." "It's only to send up their circulation," said Mr. Wibbly Stimpson. "Depend upon it, there'll be no war. None of the powers want it. Too expensive in these days. They'll see that it's settled without fighting. And even if they can't, we shan't be dragged in. We shall just let them fight it out among themselves, and when it's over we shall come in for a share of the pickings." "Well," said Clarence, as he crumpled the paper into a ball and tossed it away, "we needn't worry ourselves about Armageddon. Got something more serious to think about." "What do you mean, Clarence?" inquired his mother uneasily. "Why," he said, "it seems we've been away about 4 months. We can explain now why Miss Heritage hasn't come back with us. She's made that all right by her letter, and a trump she was to think of it. But what are we going to say when people want to know, and you can bet they will, where we've been all this time and what we've been doing?" "We can simply tell them we've been temporarily occupying exalted positions in a foreign country which we are not at liberty to mention," suggested Mrs. Wibbly Stimpson hopefully. "We could," he said, "and the reply we should get would probably be rats. They might put it more politely, but that's what it would amount to. Believe me, you'll never make people here swallow you and the governor as the late King and Queen of Fairyland. It's a jolly sight too thick. Besides, there's nothing particular in what we've done there to brag about, what?" "I at least have nothing to reproach myself with," said his mother virtuously. "Still, I agree with you, Clarence, that perhaps it would be better if we could give some account of ourselves which would sound a little less improbable." "We shall have to invent one, and as soon as we've done breakfast I vote we put our heads together and fake something up. But whatever it is, we must all remember to stick to it." And after long and strenuous cogitation, the Stimpson family managed to construct a fairly plausible story of an unexpected summons to a remote part of the world, in which they were obliged by circumstances to remain without any facilities for informing their friends of their situation. There was one danger which Mrs. Wibbly Stimpson foresaw. At any time she might encounter the Duchess of Gleneagles or Lady Muscombe in society. However, she decided that the risk was almost negligible. After all, their respective circles could not be said to intersect, and if she ever should come across either of these distinguished ladies, it would be easy to deny all recollection of ever having met them before. And thus reassured, she was able to support the official version of the family adventures so wholeheartedly that she ended by accepting it as the only authentic one. Ruby, it is true, confided a widely different account in secret to one or two of her most intimate friends. But Ruby's story met with the fate that is only too certain to befall this veracious and absolutely unexaggerated narrative. Nobody was ever found to believe a single word of it. End of chapter 22. Epilogue of In Brief Authority by F. ANSTEY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Epilogue. The reappearance of the Wibbly Stimpsons, coupled with the circumstantial explanations they gave of their mysterious absence abroad, provided their friends and neighbours with very nearly the proverbial 9 days' wonder. It might have done so even longer, but for that fateful beginning of August, when, with appalling suddenness, the blow was dealt which shattered the peace of Europe and convulsed the whole world. Then the fool's paradise in which England had so long luxuriated crumbled beneath her feet, and left her face to face with stern realities. Nothing was the same, or ever would be the same, again. Issues, causes, topics, which scarcely a week before had seemed of such vital and engrossing importance, shrivelled into insignificance or extinction under the scorching blast of war. And so it followed that Gablehurst entirely forgot its previous curiosity concerning the private affairs of the Wibberley Stimpson family, thereby relieving them from a strain on their inventive powers which they had begun to find extremely wearing. The crisis afforded Mr. Stimpson a long-desired occasion for taking a spirited part in politics. At the suggestion of his wife, who reasoned that in so conservative a neighbourhood it would be popular to condemn any steps a Radical government had taken, he summoned a public meeting to protest against the British ultimatum to Germany, on the ground that England's safety and interests alike depended on her preserving the strictest neutrality under any circumstances whatever. As his sole supporter on the platform was a recently naturalized British subject with a pronounced German accent, the result of his patriotic endeavour was, as he admitted afterwards, a little unfortunate. Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson herself was compelled to recognize, as she led him home with 2 black eyes and only 1 coat-tail, that she had been less correct than usual in estimating the local sentiment, though, of course, she ascribed his treatment entirely to the lack of tact and ability with which he had handled his subject. However, they have long since succeeded in living all that down. Mr. Stimpson very soon recognized that his views of the situation had been mistaken, and made haste to publish his conviction of the righteousness of our cause. No one now enlarges with more fervour on the ruin and disgrace that would have overtaken us if we had been induced to stand aside by persons he refers to as those infernal cranks and pacifists. Moreover, he acquired further merit by his generous contribution of £2,000 to the Prince of Wales Fund, a contribution which caused a sensation among many who could give a fairly shrewd guess at the income he drew as a partner in the firm of Cramphorn, Stimpson and Thistleton. But then they did not know that, shortly before, he had disposed of 2 exquisitely carved pieces, one diamond and the other ruby, by private contract to an American millionaire, for a sum which would have covered an even more princely donation. He has several more of these curiosities, but is reserving them for times when they are more likely to fetch their proper value. As for his wife and elder daughter, they have already achieved the distinction of sitting on more war committees and talking more at every one of them than any other ladies in Gablehurst. It is unnecessary to say that they have also knitted a prodigious quantity of garments, or at least did until they were requested to abandon their colour schemes for the regulation khaki wool, which perceptibly cooled their enthusiasm. But, after all, the greatest exhibition of self-denial was given by Ruby, who parted with her latest and best beloved acquisitions, 2 tree frogs and an axolotl, and sent the proceeds of their sale to the Red Cross Society. Clarence had made several applications for such vacant berths as he could hear of in the city, which seemed to combine the advantages of light work and a heavy salary, but somehow the principals he interviewed could not be brought to share his own conviction that he was exactly the person to suit them. He had referred them to his previous employers, but even that had led to no favourable result. The war had not gone on long, however, when it was forcibly borne in upon him that, if there was no particular demand in business circles for his services, they were needed rather urgently just then by his king and country. And so, one evening before dinner, he strolled casually into the drawing-room at Inglegarth and electrified his family by mentioning that he had offered himself that afternoon to a certain cavalry regiment and been pronounced physically fit after examination. His mother was naturally the most deeply affected by the news, though, after the first shock was over, she was sustained by recollecting that she had caught herself secretly envying a neighbour, whom she had never looked upon as a social equal, but whose boy had just obtained a commission in the Territorials. "You might have prepared us for this, Clarence," she said, as soon as she could speak. "It's a heavy blow to me, to us all. Still, if you feel it your duty to go, I hope your father and I are not the parents to hold you back. If I'm not on one of the same committees as Lady Harriet," she added more brightly, "I really think I must call and let her know. She would be so interested to hear that you are now a cavalry officer." "You might make it a field marshal, mater, while you're about it," he returned. "But if you want to be accurate, you'd better describe me as a bally trooper, because that's all I am, or likely to be." "A trooper!" exclaimed his horrified mother. "Clarence, you can't mean to tell us you've enlisted as an ordinary common soldier. I couldn't possibly permit you to throw yourself away like that. Nor, I am sure, will your father. Sidney, of course you will insist on Clarence's explaining at once to the Colonel, or whoever accepted him, that he finds we object so strongly to his joining that he is obliged to withdraw his offer." "Certainly," said Mr. Stimson. "Certainly. It's not too late yet, my boy. You've only to say that we can't allow it. You're more badly wanted at home, and they're sure to let you off." "Can't quite see myself telling 'em that, Governor, even if I wanted to be let off, which I don't." "After the way you've been brought up and everything," cried Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson. "To sink to this! Has it occurred to you that you would have to associate entirely with persons of the very lowest class?" "You wouldn't say that if you'd seen some of the Johnnies who passed the vet with me," he replied. "And, as to classes, all that tosh is done away with now. There's only one class a fellow can't afford to associate with, the slackers who ought to be in khaki and aren't. I couldn't have stuck being in that crowd any longer, and I'm jolly lucky to have got well out of it." "All the same, Clarence," lamented his mother, "you must see what a terrible come down it is for you, who not so very long ago were a Crown Prince." "I thought we'd agreed to forget all that, Mater," he said, wincing slightly. "Anyway, if I don't turn out a better Tommy than I did a Prince, they won't have me in the regiment long. But I'm not going to get the push this time, if I can help it. Come, Mater," he concluded, "don't worry any more over what's done and can't be undone. Just try and make the best of it." But this was beyond Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson's philosophy just then. If he'd been leaving his comfortable home with a commission as sub-lieutenant, she might have been able to find some slight consolation in announcing the fact to her friends. Now she would have to make the humiliating admission that he was nothing more than a common trooper, after which she felt she would never be able to hold up her head again. As things turned out, these apprehensions proved unfounded, for it seemed that other young Gablehurst men belonging to families in as good a position as her own had enlisted as privates, and, so far from being considered to have brought discredit on their parentage, were regarded with general approval. And the pride with which their mothers spoke of them encouraged Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson to be even prouder of Clarence, as the only one who had joined a cavalry regiment. When he was undergoing the necessary training with the reserve regiment, and first had to enter the riding school, he was prepared, remembering how suddenly and completely his control of Maerchenland horses had left him, for some highly unpleasant experiences. Daphne's pendant had been left in safe custody at Inglegarth, and, even if he had had any idea that it had assisted his horsemanship, which he was far from suspecting, he would not have brought it with him, lest he should lose a thing which Daphne had said he would please her by keeping. Probably, had he brought and been allowed to wear the token, it would not have made any impression whatever on the mind of a British charger. But fortunately no talisman was needed. All the riding in Maerchenland, while his horses continued docile, had not been without some good result after all. At least, he found that he had quite as good a seat as any of his fellow recruits, and a very much better one than most of them. And the months of training passed, not unhappily. He made friends, not all of them in his own class. He set himself to learn his job as quickly and thoroughly as he could, and his sergeant major spoke of him, though not in his presence, as a smart young chap who showed more sense than some he had to do with. He had not been many weeks in the regiment before he got his first stripe, and when he came home on furlough he was able to inform his family that he had just been promoted to be a full-blown corporal. It was a farewell visit, as he was being sent out in a day or two with a draft to his regiment at the front. He had grown broader across the chest, and looked extremely brown and fit, while his family noticed that he no longer ended his remarks with "What?" Once or twice he expressed his satisfaction at getting the chance at last of having a go at the Boches, but he said very little about the future, and seemed more interested in hearing about Ruby's new school and Edna's ambulance class. Then he left them, and for months after that they had to endure the long strain of constant anxiety and suspense which few British households have escaped in these dark times. Clarence had always been a poor correspondent, and his letters, though fairly regular, were short and wanting in details. But he said the regiment was doing dismounted work in the trenches, that he was acquiring the habit of sleeping quite soundly under shell fire, that he had been much cut up by losing some of his best pals, but so far had not been hit himself, though he had had several narrow shaves. He kept pretty fit, but was a bit fed up with trench work, though he didn't see an earthly of riding in a cavalry charge at present. The last letter was dated February. After that came a silence, which was explained by an official letter stating that he was in a field hospital, severely wounded. Inglegarth remained for days in helpless misery, dreading the worst, till they were relieved by the news that he was now in a base hospital and going on well. But it was some weeks before he could be moved to London, and longer still before he was convalescent enough to be taken to his own home, where the joy of seeing him recover so rapidly was checked by the knowledge that he would only leave them the sooner. He was much the same slangy and casual Clarence they had known, though rather subdued, but he had moods of sombre silence at times which none of them dared to interrupt, when his eyes seemed to be looking upon sights they had seen and would fain forget. As to his own doings he said but little, though he told them something of his experiences during his last week at the front, how the regiment had been rushed up in motor buses from Brew to Ypres, how they had marched to the reformatory which they had defended for 5 days under heavy fire, how they had then dug caverns and occupied trenches to the south of the Menin road, and how the trenches had been mined by the enemy, and 5 officers killed and 64 casualties, of which latter he was one. Before he was pronounced fit for active service again, he heard that he had been recommended for a commission, and given one in another cavalry regiment, which had very nearly the same prestige and traditions as his own, though he would have been the last to admit it till then. Thus was Mrs. Wibberley Stimpson's dearest desire at last attained. She could now inform her friends and acquaintances that her boy was actually a subaltern, while, even in conversation with strangers, it was always possible to lead up to the fact by enlarging on the heavy cost of a cavalry officer's kit. And yet, in fairness to her, it may be said that, with all her striving after social distinction, if she had been required to choose between her son returning to the front with a commission and keeping him at home with no higher rank than that of a corporal, she would have chosen the latter without a moment's hesitation. But since the choice was not given her, Clarence's promotion did much to console her for his approaching departure, at least until the day arrived when she turned blindly away from the platform with an aching dread that the train was bearing him out of her life for ever. That was several months ago, and Second Lieutenant Stimpson, he dropped the Wibberley when he first enlisted, has been at the front ever since. There is a certain endless road, bordered by splintered stumps, which once were poplars, and pitted in places with deep shell holes, that he knows only too well, having taken his troop along it many a night to relieve the party in the trenches. Even now, when he comes to the group of ruined cottages, at which he has to leave the road and strike across country into the danger zone, he is unpleasantly conscious of a sinking at his heart at the prospect of another week or so of that infernal existence of shattering noise, flying death splinters, and sickening sights and smells. There he will have to be constantly on the watch. Meals and sleep can only be snatched at precarious intervals, and seldom without disturbance. If there is anything more nerve-racking than the scream of shells and the hail of shrapnel, it is the lull that follows, when he waits for the enemy's rush to begin. And yet, the moment he finds himself back in the trench again, he becomes acclimatized. His men speak of him as a cool and resourceful young officer under any difficulties, while on more than one occasion he has done some daring and very useful reconnoitring work that may even earn him mention in dispatches. But at present he is enjoying one of his hard-earned rests, being billeted in a farmhouse well away from the firing line. Here, having no duties or responsibilities to fix all his thoughts on the present, he can allow them to dwell on the future for a while. This desperate and relentless war will come to an end in time. How soon he knows no more than anyone, but that it will end in victory for England and her allies he has no doubt whatever. He is equally sure, though he could not account for this certainty, that, unlike many a better fellow than himself, he will live to see his country at peace once more. But what is he to do then? Even if an opening in the city presented itself, he could never stick an office again after this. On the other hand, even if he gets another step or two, he will find it difficult to live on his pay in a crack cavalry regiment. However, The governor will no doubt give him an allowance that will enable him to stay in the service. The mater can be safely trusted to see to that. So, this question being satisfactorily disposed of, his thoughts, as usual on these occasions, drift back to Maerchenland, and particularly to Daphne's parting words on the night he left the palace. Would she think, he wonders, that he has done something to justify her belief in him? At least, she might be pleased if she knew that he could not fairly be described any longer as a useless rotter. Only, he tells himself disconsolately, she never will know. England's no country of hers now, and she wouldn't feel enough interest in it even to send the Baron across in the stork car for a daily paper. If she did, she'd be none the wiser, because he'd be sure to bring the Poultry Fancier's Journal, or the Financial News, or something of that sort. And after all, if she had any idea of the ghastly business that has been going on in this old world for the last year, she's too much heart to be happy, even in Maerchenland. But now she'll go on being happy for the rest of her life, bless her, and if she gives me a thought now and then, well, it will be a jolly sight more than I deserve. The End. Recording by Anna Simon, Nijmegen, the Netherlands, 2012.